The rifle lay on the presentation rack like something dragged out of a museum basement, and half the classroom was already laughing before instructor Corin raised a hand for quiet. "That is a joke," said Asen Threl from the second row, his mandibles clicking with amusement. "Cadet Voss brought a joke to arms trials." Dara Voss stood at the rack with her hands loose at her sides and said nothing. The rifle was walnut-stocked, blued steel gone gray at the edges from decades of handling, a bolt action with iron sights, and not 1 gram of smart circuitry anywhere in it. Beside it on the long steel table sat 11 other weapons, rail carbines, particle lances, a Keithrani slug thrower the size of a fence post, each one blinking with its own diagnostic telemetry, feeding data to the classroom display in real time. Her rifle fed nothing. It just lay there, dumb and old and hers. "Quiet," Instructor Corin said again, and this time the room actually quieted because Corin's voice carried the particular flatness of an Ithran losing patience, and none of them wanted to find out what came after that flatness ran out. She was tall and silver-skinned, with joints that bent 1 degree too many in each limb, and she had been teaching arms trials long enough to have opinions about wasted class time. She looked at the rifle for a long moment. "Cadet Voss, explain." "It was my grandmother's," Dara said. "It works. It has no power cell. Doesn't need one." A ripple of laughter went through the room again, softer this time, more nervous than cruel. Corin didn't join it. She walked down the row of weapons with her hands clasped behind her back, the way she always did during inspection, and stopped in front of the rifle, studying it the way a woman studies a species of insect she has never personally seen but has read about in old textbooks. "No optics," she said. "No recoil compensation, no round counter. Cadet, do you understand what this class is for?" "Classification and readiness assessment," Dara said. "Yes, ma'am." "Then you understand that I am required to run every weapon on this table through the calibrator before the period ends, regardless of my personal opinion of its." She paused, choosing the word with visible care. "Vintage." "Yes, ma'am." "Very well." Corin's mouth, a thin lipless seam that only ever approximated human expression when she wanted it to, twitched at one corner. "Let's give the class something instructional. Bring it up." Dara carried the rifle to the calibrator herself. It was a squat gray column at the front of the room, humming faintly, its intake cradle lined with soft blue light. She had seen it eat modern weapons in under 4 seconds, spit back a full profile, caliber, energy yield, kill, radius, threat class, onto the wall display for the whole room to study. She laid the rifle in the cradle and stepped back. Asen Threl leaned toward the cadet next to him, an Ithran named Sewell, and said, not quietly enough, "I give it a Class 9, farming implement." The calibrator's light shifted from blue to a searching amber. Somewhere inside the column, sensors that had scanned starship hulls and siege cannons, and the teeth of things that ate starship hulls went to work on 80-year-old steel. The hum climbed half an octave. On the wall display, a readout began assembling itself. Caliber data first, then a metallurgical breakdown, then something the class had never seen a readout do before. A hard stutter, 3 full seconds of nothing, the little activity ring spinning in place like the machine had lost its train of thought. "Diagnostic fault," Corin muttered, stepping toward the console. "Run it again." The display cleared itself and rebuilt from black in half a second, and this time nothing about it looked routine. There was no caliber line, no energy yield, no kill radius. There was a single classification field, bordered in a red that the calibrator reserved for exactly one purpose, and inside it, in block compact script that every species in the room could read, 2 words sat glowing against the dark. "Alpha Predator." Nobody laughed. The activity ring kept spinning underneath the words, as if the machine itself wanted a second opinion, and then it stopped, and the classification held, and the room went so silent that Dara could hear the ventilation system cycling somewhere behind the wall panels. A low mechanical breath, in and out, in and out, the only sound left in a room that 30 seconds ago had been full of laughter. Asen Threll's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely. Instructor Corin stood very still in front of the console, her silver face unreadable, one long jointed hand hovering an inch above the controls like she wasn't sure yet whether touching them again was wise. Behind her on the display, the red border pulsed once, slow, patient, the way an old wound pulses before you remember it's there. Dara looked at the readout, then at her rifle sitting dumb and undramatic in its cradle of blue light, then back at the two words on the wall. She felt, distantly, the way she imagined a person felt watching weather roll in from very far away, not afraid yet, just aware that the shape of the day had changed, and there was no getting it back. "Ma'am," she said, into the silence, because someone had to say something and it clearly wasn't going to be anyone else. "Is that a normal fault?" Corin didn't answer for 3 full seconds, which for an Ithran instructor who answered everything instantly was itself an answer. "No, Cadet Voss," she said finally, "it is not." She reached out and very carefully, as if the rifle might do something on its own if handled wrong, lifted it from the cradle and set it back on the presentation rack. Then she turned to the class, and her voice had lost every trace of the dry classroom flatness it had carried 30 seconds earlier. "Class dismissed early. Cadet Voss, stay." Nobody moved for a second. Then chairs began scraping, and cadets filed out in a silence so total it was almost louder than the laughter had been, throwing looks back over their shoulders the whole way, at the rifle, at Dara, at the red-bordered words still glowing on the wall. Asen Threll was the last one through the door, and he didn't look back at all, which told Dara more than if he had. When the room emptied, Instructor Corin picked up her data slate, tapped it twice, and studied whatever came up with an expression Dara had never seen on her before. Not annoyance, not the dry professional patience she wore like a second skin, something closer to caution. "How long has your family owned this weapon?" Corin said. "I don't know exactly. My grandmother had it before my mother was born." Dara stopped, recalibrating the sentence because bureaucratic caution was contagious. "It's old. Older than my mother, I mean. My grandmother kept it in a case in the mudroom, cleaned it every spring whether she'd used it or not." "Did she tell you why she kept it?" "She said it was hers and it worked and that was reason enough." Dara paused. She wasn't a person who explained things twice. Corin's slate chimed, low and insistent, a sound Dara hadn't heard from academy equipment before. The instructor looked down at it, and whatever she read there made her set the slate flat on the console, face down, as if putting distance between herself and the words on it. "The calibrator doesn't return a false positive on that classification," Corin said. "It has run for 211 standard years without one. It draws from the full threat archive of the compact, every catalog species, every recorded weapon signature, cross-referenced against a database older than either of our world's spacefaring histories. When it returns Alpha Predator, it is not guessing." "What does it mean?" "It means," Corin said, and there was something almost gentle in how carefully she said it, the way you tell a patient their test results, that somewhere in the deep archive, something scanned that exact metallurgical and residue signature before, a very long time ago, and rated whatever produced it as the single most dangerous classification the compact catalog has, above warband, above apex fauna, above anything currently on record as an active threat. There are perhaps a dozen entries under that heading in the entire archive, and most of them are extinct. Dara looked at the rifle. It looked back at her, or would have if rifles looked at things, an old brown stock, a worn bolt handle, a strap her grandmother had replaced twice with her own stitching. It did not look like the single most dangerous thing in a database that spanned centuries and 100 worlds. It looked like it belonged in a closet. "That's not possible," Dara said, and she said it the way she said most things, flat and unhurried, because panic had never once in her life solved a problem faster than a clear head had. "It's a hunting rifle. My grandmother shot deer with it. Maybe a coyote or two." "I don't doubt what you believe about it," Corin said. "I am telling you what the machine believes about it. Those are, at the moment, two very different things, and I suspect we are all about to find out which one is correct." She picked the slate back up, turned it over, and read the message a second time, her long fingers drumming once against its edge. "The dean's office has already been notified. That is not something I did. The calibrator reports flagged classifications automatically to a channel I don't have access to close." "So what happens now?" Corin looked at her for a long moment, really looked. The way she hadn't during the lesson. The way an instructor looks at a cadet she is quietly revising her opinion of. "Now," she said, "you go see the dean, and you bring the rifle with you, because I don't think anyone above my pay grade is going to believe this happened unless they see the thing that did it." She held out the rifle, stock first, the way Dara's grandmother always had, and for just a moment her silver hand didn't quite want to let go of it. "Cadet Voss," Corin said, "for what it's worth, you didn't flinch when the room laughed at you, and you haven't flinched since the room stopped. Whatever this turns out to be, keep doing that. It will matter more than you think in the next several days." Dara took the rifle, slung it, and did not ask what the instructor meant, because she suspected she was about to find out the hard way. The walk to the dean's office took her the length of the academy's spine corridor, past viewports that looked down on the slow gray curve of the Calyx anchor, and the 100 docked ships beyond it, needle-thin cruisers and squat cargo haulers wearing the markings of a dozen member worlds. Calyx Combat Academy did not sit on a planet. It orbited one, a way station built into the broken ring of an ancient shipyard nobody quite remembered constructing, repurposed by the Compact 3 centuries ago into the place where its member species sent their best and their difficult and lately, their newest arrivals. Earth had been a provisional member of the Compact for 3 years, long enough for the first intake of human cadets to reach second-year standing. Not long enough for anyone here to stop watching them like a species still on probation, because that was exactly what they were. The treaty was explicit about it, reviewed annually, revocable by a council vote if Earth's representatives were judged, in the treaty's careful phrasing, insufficiently civilized for continued membership. Dara had grown up with that phrase hanging over her like weather. Everyone in her intake had. There were 9 human cadets total in the academy, scattered across 3 class years, out of a student body pushing 4,000. Dara's roommate, Sana Akefer, was one of them, and she was waiting outside the dean's office when Dara arrived, arms crossed, dark eyes sharp with the particular alarm of someone who has already heard secondhand what happened and doesn't believe half of it. "Corin's aide calmed the dorm," Sana said, falling into step beside her. "Said you broke the calibrator." "I didn't break it." "That's not what 4 different people are telling me. One version has you pulling a knife on Threll. Another has the machine catching fire." Neither of those things happened. Dara adjusted the rifle strap on her shoulder. It scanned Grandma Edda's rifle and called it an Alpha Predator. Sana stopped walking. "That's a real classification. I thought that was a training manual myth. Like the Boogeyman tier, the one instructors threaten first-years with. Apparently it's real enough that the dean's office got a notification before I did." "Okay," Sana fell back into step faster now. "Okay, I don't love that sentence, Dara." "Neither do I." The dean's outer office was small and overfurnished in the Compact's preferred administrative style, all soft curved chairs built for 6 different body plans, and none of them comfortable for a human spine. A mordant clerk with slate-gray skin and no visible eyes waved them through without a word, which told Dara that whatever was waiting inside had already been cleared for her arrival specifically. Sana didn't get waved through. She got a hand held up, politely, firmly, at the threshold. "I'll be here," Sana said. "Don't do anything the rifle would be proud of." Dean Ilyo Vask's office was a wide half-circle overlooking the same dockship view as the corridor, and the dean himself was standing at the window with his back to the door when Dara entered, hands folded behind him in a posture she recognized immediately as performative calm. The kind of stillness a person adopts specifically because the alternative would show too much. Mordants were slender, gray, long-necked, and famously difficult to read, but Dara had spent 3 years learning that difficult did not mean impossible. "Cadet Voss," Vask said without turning, "set the weapon on the table. Do not touch the calibrator readout again once you've done that. We have already run our own scan from this office remotely to rule out equipment malfunction in Instructor Korin's classroom." He turned, finally, and his flat black eyes moved from Dara's face to the rifle and stayed there. The result was identical. Dara set the rifle down. "Then it's not a malfunction." "No, it is not." Vask's long fingers steepled in front of him. "Do you understand the position this puts the Academy in, Cadet? Do you understand the position it puts your species in?" "I'm starting to. I doubt that very much, but I will explain regardless, because I would rather you hear it from me than from rumor." He walked slowly around the table, keeping the rifle between them the entire time, the way a man keeps a table between himself and a dog he isn't sure of. "Earth's provisional status comes up for full council review in 11 weeks. The review will ask one question above all others. Is humanity a species the compact can safely, permanently integrate? Every incident involving a human cadet during this review window is logged, weighted, and forwarded to the Council's Assessment Committee. A brawl in the mess hall, a failed exam, a classification anomaly in arms trials." He let that last one sit. "Do you see the shape of the problem now? You think this makes us look dangerous?" "I think," Vask said, "that a machine which has operated without a single false positive for 2 centuries just informed a room of 40 cadets that a human civilian heirloom carries the same threat signature as the worst entities the Compact has ever catalogued. I do not need to think anything about whether that looks dangerous, Cadet Voss. It simply is." Dara kept her hands loose at her sides, the way she had in the classroom, and made herself breathe slow. "So what happens to the rifle?" "That is not entirely my decision. Archive protocol requires that any Alpha-tier classification, once confirmed, be reported directly to the archive itself, which will send its own adjudicator to verify the finding independently before any action is taken. That adjudicator is already in transit. They will arrive within the week." Vask's eyes finally left the rifle and settled back on her. "In the meantime, the weapon is confiscated, pending review, and you, Cadet Voss, are restricted to Academy grounds and subject to whatever additional evaluation the archive deems necessary. You're taking Grandma Edda's rifle." "I am securing evidence relevant to a classification with treaty-level implications for your entire species," Vask said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "I would do the same if it were a Keithrani heirloom or a Mordant one. This is not persecution, Cadet. This is procedure." Dara looked at the rifle sitting on the table between them, and for a moment she thought of her grandmother's hands, spotted and steady, running an oiled cloth down that same barrel every spring on the back porch, telling her that a gun you didn't understand was a gun you shouldn't own. She wondered, standing there, whether her grandmother had understood this one at all, or whether the not understanding had been the whole point. A tool kept clean and ready and never once explained, because some things a person carries without asking why. "Can I ask a question?" Dara said. "You may. If the archive verifies the classification, if this adjudicator agrees with the machine, what happens to Earth's review?" Vask was quiet for a moment, and something in his flat black eyes shifted, just slightly. into an expression Dara couldn't fully name but recognized as closer to worry than to procedure. "I genuinely do not know, Cadet Voss," he said. "That has never happened before. There is no precedent for a provisional member species producing an Alpha-tier weapon signature during its review window because no provisional member species ever has. You are, as of this afternoon, the only case on record." He gestured toward the door. "Which is precisely why I need you calm, cooperative, and visible during the adjudicator's visit, not defiant, not frightened. Simply present, do you understand?" "I understand." "Then go. Instructor Corin will inform you of your restricted schedule by end of day." He paused, and added, almost as an afterthought in a voice that had lost some of its administrative polish, "For what it is worth, Cadet Voss, I do not think you understand what you are carrying. I am not certain anyone does yet. That uncertainty is the only thing standing between this situation being manageable and this situation being catastrophic. I would very much like it to stay manageable." Dara left the rifle on the table, because there was nothing else to do, and walked out past the mordant clerk into the corridor where Sana was waiting, arms still crossed, watching her face for a verdict. "Well," Sana said, "they're keeping the rifle. An archive adjudicator is coming to verify the classification, and apparently Earth's whole membership review might ride on what they find." Sana was quiet for a second. Then, quietly, with the particular gallows humor that had kept the two of them sane through 18 months of academy life among species that found most human jokes either baffling or alarming, she said, "So, normal Tuesday, then." Dara almost smiled, almost normal. They walked back toward the dormitory wing together, past cadets who stopped talking as they passed, and started again the moment they'd gone by, the particular hum of a rumor traveling faster than either of them could outwalk it. By the time they reached the human quarters, 9 bunks in a corridor built for creatures half again their size, ceilings too high, furniture too wide, the story had already mutated twice more. Dara heard one version where she'd threatened Instructor Corin, another where the rifle had discharged on its own inside the calibrator. She let them pass without comment, because arguing with a rumor only fed it, and because she had learned, 3 years into a world that watched her species like a held breath, that the only answer that mattered was the one you gave with your hands steady and your face unbothered. That night, lying in the narrow bunk with the ceiling too far above her and the station's slow hum in the walls, she thought about her grandmother's rifle sitting alone on a table in a locked room, and she thought about the word Alpha Predator glowing red against a classroom wall, and she thought, not for the first time since she'd left Earth, that there were parts of her family's history nobody had ever bothered to write down, and that she was about to find out why. By the second day, the restriction had a shape to it. Dara was permitted to attend classes, permitted to eat in the mess hall, permitted to walk the corridors between approved hours, and escorted, loosely but unmistakably, by a rotating pair of academy security whenever she did any of it. Sana called them her honor guard. Asen Threll, when their paths crossed in the mess hall queue on the second morning, called them something else, in Keithrani, low enough that the translation implant in Dara's ear only caught half of it before he walked past with his tray held stiff and his eyes forward, careful not to look at her directly. That was new. Threll had never once in 18 months failed to look at a human directly. Looking at them directly and finding something lacking was more or less his hobby. "He's scared of you now," Sana said, watching him go. "That's hilarious." "He's scared of the rifle." "Same thing currently." Dara didn't think it was the same thing at all, but she let it go, because she had spent the previous night doing the one piece of homework nobody at the academy had assigned her, digging through the handful of family files she'd brought from Earth on a data chip the size of her thumbnail, half of it scanned photographs, half of it her grandmother's handwriting, cramped and slanted and stubborn even on paper. There wasn't much. Etta Voss had not been a woman who kept a diary in any conventional sense. What she had kept, apparently, without ever telling anyone why, was a single thin ledger, the kind farmers used for feed costs and calving records, with one page, dated in the summer of the year Dara's mother liked to call the year before everything. That had nothing to do with feed costs at all. Dara had read it a dozen times since finding the scan 2 years ago, back when it had seemed like nothing more than a strange old story, the kind every family has tucked in a drawer. She read it again now, sitting cross-legged on her bunk with Sana half asleep across the room, the station's night cycle lighting dimmed to a color that was supposed to approximate Earth dusk and mostly just looked gray. Lights in the North Pasture again, 3 nights running. Told Pa it was kids from town messing with the Halloran boys' truck. It wasn't. Saw it myself the 3rd night, low over the tree line, no sound to it at all, which is its own kind of wrong, an engine that big should roar, and this one didn't so much as hum. Something came down past the ridge line near the old well. I took the rifle because Pa was in town, and the coyotes had been bad that spring, and a girl alone at night takes what she has. Found 3 of them near the well by moonlight, tall as men but wrong in the shoulders, wrong in how they stood, wearing something that caught the light like wet leather. They had nets, actual nets like something out of an old picture book, and a box between them that hummed the way the light in the sky had. They didn't see me until I was 30 feet off. One of them turned and looked at me the way a man looks at a deer he's already decided is his. I did not care for that look. I do not plan on ever caring for it. I put the first round through the box because it was making a sound I didn't like, and the box seemed like the heart of the operation, whatever the operation was. The other 2 came at me fast, faster than a man has any business moving, and I put them both down before either one closed the distance, because Pa taught me to reload without looking at my hands, and I have never once in my life been grateful for anything the way I was grateful for that in the space of about 4 seconds. There was a 4th one I never saw, back at whatever they'd landed in the North Pasture, and it took off in a hurry once the shooting stopped, straight up, gone in a blink, no sound to that either. I buried what I could of the other 3 where nobody plows, told Pa the coyotes had been at something and left it there. I am keeping this rifle oiled and loaded from here to the day I die, and I am not telling a living soul what it's for, because there is no version of telling this story that ends with anyone believing me, and there is no version of not telling it that leaves me one bit less prepared for it happening again. It never happened again. Not to Etta Voss, not in the 61 years she lived after that entry. Not once that Dara had ever heard about growing up on the same land, hunting the same tree line, being handed the same rifle across a kitchen table with the same instruction. Clean it every spring, keep it loaded, don't ask it questions it can't answer. Dara had believed for 2 years that the ledger page was a story her grandmother had half invented in old age, the kind of thing lonely people sometimes wrote down to give a strange memory a shape it could survive in. She had never once considered that it might be evidence. She thought about it differently now. She didn't sleep much that night, and when Instructor Corin's summons came through her slate at 0600 the next morning, report to the Arms Trials Annex, full uniform weapon evaluation continuing, she was already awake and already dressed, sitting on the edge of her bunk with the ledger page open on the small screen, reading it again in the dark like it might say something different this time. The annex was a smaller room than the main classroom, windowless, built for exactly this kind of private evaluation. And when Dara arrived, Instructor Corin was already there along with 2 figures Dara didn't recognize, a mordant technician from records, and someone else, taller, robed in unadorned gray, standing very still near the back wall in a way that made the whole room feel like it was arranged around them without anyone having said so out loud. "Cadet Voss," Corin said, "this is Archivist Warden Ren Severeth. They arrived ahead of schedule." The warden turned, and Dara understood immediately why the room had rearranged itself. Oculari were not strictly humanoid, though they occupied roughly the shape of one tall, robed to the floor in fabric that didn't quite move like fabric, and where a face should have been there was instead a smooth expanse of pale gray skin with no eyes at all. No mouth Dara could find, nothing but a faint, slow shifting beneath the surface like something turning over in deep water. The compact's translation systems rendered their speech as a calm, unhurried baritone that seemed to arrive from everywhere in the room at once rather than from any single point. "Cadet Voss," the warden said, "I have read the classroom report. I have reviewed the calibrator's raw data twice, independently of the Academy's systems, because a result of this magnitude deserves more than institutional trust." A pause, unreadable, the surface of that faceless head shifting faintly. "The classification holds. I confirm it." Corin's silver shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. Not relief, Dara thought, but the particular tension of someone whose private hope had just been proven wrong. "Confirm it as what exactly?" Dara said. "What does Alpha Predator actually mean? Nobody's told me the whole thing, just that it's rare and it's bad." "It does not mean bad," the warden said, and something in the flat certainty of the correction made both Corin and the mordant technician look up. "It means unmanageable. The distinction matters, Cadet, and I suspect it will matter to you more than anyone else in this room. The archive does not classify morality. It classifies outcome. An Alpha Predator entry is reserved for a signature that, when historically encountered by an armed and organized party, resulted in that party's total operational failure, every member killed, captured, or driven off, with no recorded instance of the reverse outcome occurring. It is not a statement about intent. It is a statement about what happened every single time someone tried." "Every single time," Dara said. "How many times does the archive have on file?" "3, the warden said. "All from the same incident, all within the same 11 minutes, all attributed to a single unidentified signature source matching your weapon's residue and metallurgy to a confidence interval. I have never personally seen the calibrator return for a 2-century-old civilian firearm." A pause. "I would like you to tell me, in your own words, everything you know about how your family came to own this weapon." Dara looked at Corin, who gave her the smallest possible nod, and then at the warden's faceless, patient stillness, and she thought about her grandmother's cramped handwriting, about a box that hummed in 3 shapes by moonlight and a 4th that got away clean. "I think I might actually know something about that," she said. "But you're not going to like how I found out." "Cadet Voss," the warden said, with something in that calm baritone that might, in a being with a face, have been the ghost of interest, "I am several thousand years past the point of needing to like an answer. I only need it to be true. Please, begin." Dara told it plainly, the way her grandmother would have told it if her grandmother had ever told it to anyone at all. No embellishment, no drama, just the facts laid out one after another the way you describe a fence line that needed mending. The lights in the north pasture, the sound that wasn't a sound, 3 shapes by the well, tall and wrong in the shoulders, wearing something that caught moonlight like wet leather, a humming box. A 4th shape that got away clean, straight up, gone in a blink. She didn't editorialize. She didn't need to. The warden's faceless head had gone very still partway through, that slow shifting beneath the gray skin arrested entirely, and by the time she finished, even Corin was watching the oculari instead of her. "The box," the warden said when she'd finished. "Your grandmother's account states she fired on it first, before the 2 that closed distance. Why?" "She said it was making a sound she didn't like." "What kind of sound?" Dara pulled up the ledger scan on her slate and read the line again, though she already had it memorized. A humming, like the light in the sky had. She thought it seemed like the heart of the operation. Something happened in the room that Dara didn't have a name for, not a sound exactly, more a change in the quality of the air, like a held breath finally released. The warden turned to the mordant technician, who had been standing silent and forgotten near the door this entire time, and said something in a language the translation system didn't render at all, just left as a low, untranslated murmur. The technician's slate-gray face went, if possible, a shade grayer. "Pull the deep archive," the warden said, in compact standard now, for the benefit of the room. "Cross-reference incident signature classes from that decadal window, filtered for any recorded loss of a containment or capture apparatus in the field. Do it now, please, not through the queue." "That will take hours, even expedited," the technician said. "Then it takes hours." The warden turned back to Dara, and though there was no face to read, something in the stillness had shifted into a register that felt, unmistakably, like the beginning of respect. "Cadet Voss, do you understand what a capture apparatus is used for?" "I can guess." "I would rather you not guess. Not yet. Guessing invites conclusions the evidence hasn't earned." The warden's baritone stayed level, but there was a new weight underneath it now, careful, deliberate. "What I can tell you without speculation is this. Your grandmother's account describes an engagement with an armed and organized party carrying specialized field equipment. At night, on unfamiliar terrain, using a weapon with no optics and no assistance of any kind. And she ended that engagement in under a minute, alone, without injury she thought worth recording. That is either the most extraordinary act of improvised combat in this archive's recorded history, or it is something else entirely. I do not yet know which. I intend to find out, and I would like your help doing it." "What kind of help?" "Verification. The archive does not accept a single witness account, however detailed, as confirmation of a threat classification this severe, not even alongside a matching weapon signature. It requires demonstrated capability. I would like to construct a controlled evaluation. Nothing resembling your grandmother's encounter. That would be reckless, and I have no interest in reckless. A measured series of trials, assessing marksmanship, composure under simulated threat, tactical improvisation, and resourcefulness with minimal equipment. If your bloodline and your training produce results consistent with what the archive recorded 8 decades ago, I will have grounds to understand this classification rather than simply confirm it. If they do not, I will have grounds to question whether the classification was ever about you, your family, or your species at all. And that, Cadet Voss, may matter a great deal to the Council currently deciding whether your entire world gets to stay in this compact." Corin cleared her throat, the closest an Ithran came to hesitating out loud. "Warden, with respect, Cadet Voss is a second-year cadet. She has not completed advanced combat coursework. If the evaluation is calibrated against an alpha-tier historical benchmark, it will not kill her, instructor," the warden said, not unkindly. "I am not in the business of confirming classifications by getting cadets killed. It will, however, be difficult. Difficult in ways this academy has not asked of a second year in a very long time, if ever. I would understand if you object." "I'm not objecting for her," Corin said. "I'm objecting because someone should and she won't." Dara looked at Corin, really looked, the way you look at someone who has just, without quite meaning to, said something true about you in front of a stranger, and then at the warden's patient, faceless stillness. "I'll do it," Dara said. "You may want more time to consider." "I've had 3 years to consider what it means to be the species everyone's still deciding whether to trust," Dara said. "I don't need more time. I need to know what my grandmother actually did in that pasture, and it sounds like this is the only way anyone's going to find out. So, what's first?" The warden was quiet for a moment, that slow shifting beneath gray skin resuming, thoughtful now rather than arrested. "First," the warden said, "we see what you can do with a rifle you've never fired a day in your life. Report to the Deep Range Annex tomorrow at 0700. Instructor Corin will supervise, I will observe." A pause. "And Cadet Voss, bring nothing with you. No optics, no assistance systems, no advantage beyond what your species carried into that pasture 80 years ago. If your archive entry is real, I want to see it earned honestly, not borrowed from a modern rack." It was on the walk back from the annex. Corin a silent, thoughtful shape beside her, and the security escort trailing a respectful 10 paces back, that they passed the kennel corridor outside the Academy's field operations wing, a stretch of hallway Dara had walked 100 times without incident, home to the handful of trained, tracking hounds the compact used for search and rescue drills. Squat gray-hided things with too many legs, and a nose sensitive enough to find a lost cadet through 6 inches of hull plating. Today, as she passed the kennel gate, all 4 of them came up off their haunches at once, hackles rising along ridged spines, and backed themselves into the far corner of the enclosure in a single low, uneasy motion, not barking, not growling, just watching her go by with every line of their bodies pulled tight and small, the universal posture of something that has decided, without needing to think about it twice, that the thing walking past is not something to challenge. The handler, a broad-shouldered Keithrani Dara vaguely recognized from mess hall rotations, frowned after them, then after her, then said nothing at all, which by now Dara was starting to recognize as the loudest reaction anyone on this station knew how to give. Corin didn't say anything either, but she slowed her pace just slightly to walk half a step closer to Dara's shoulder for the rest of the corridor, and Dara understood, without either of them saying it out loud, that whatever this was, it had stopped being an abstract classification on a wall display. It had started being a thing the whole station's instincts could feel coming before anyone's mind had caught up to explain it. The Deep Range Annex was a long gray hall built into the station's outer ring, its far wall a full kilometer of adjustable terrain projection, close enough to real matter-state simulation that a fired round would kick actual dust off a hologram of actual dirt. Dara had trained there twice before, both times with a standard-issue rail carbine that did most of the thinking for her, wind correction, range finding, recoil damping, a dozen small mercies she'd never thought to be grateful for, until instructor Corin set a plain steel bolt action on the bench in front of her the next morning and said, "This is the closest match to your grandmother's weapon the armory could configure on short notice. No optics, no assist. You load it yourself, you correct for wind yourself, you call your own shots." Word had gotten out, it always did. By 0700 there were a dozen cadets pressed against the observation glass at the back of the annex. Sana in the front row, arms crossed, deliberately not smiling. Asen Threll a few places down from her, arms also crossed, deliberately not looking like he cared, and failing at it in a way that would have been funny under different circumstances. The warden stood apart from all of them, a still gray shape near the range control console, unbothered by the crowd in a way that suggested crowds had simply never registered to them as a category of thing worth being bothered by. "The range will present 5 targets," Corin said, low enough that it wouldn't carry to the glass. "Variable distance, variable exposure time, movement patterns drawn from historical combat data, not scripted for you, not calibrated soft. I want to be honest with you, Cadet Voss, because I think you'd rather I was. This profile is not designed for a second year. It's not designed for most fourth years. If you miss badly, nobody in this room is going to think less of you. A rifle like this takes most of my species, a full training cycle just to zero properly." "Understood," Dara said, and settled onto the firing line. And it was only once her cheek found the stock and her offhand found the fore-end that something in her shoulders came loose that hadn't been loose in 3 years. A specific, familiar quiet, the same quiet she used to feel on the back porch at 11 years old with her grandmother's hand steadying the barrel over hers. "Don't hold your breath, girl. You're not drowning. You're just being still." The first target came up at 200 meters, exposure window under 2 seconds, and she put a round through it before the 2 seconds had finished passing. The second came at 300, angled, half obscured by simulated brush, and she adjusted for the wind reading on the range display without needing to be told the display existed. The third and fourth came together, staggered by half a second, one near, one far, and she took the near one first out of pure reflex. Closer threat, closer danger. A decision made somewhere below conscious thought. Then swung and took the far one with a bolt cycle so fast Corin, watching from the console, actually leaned forward. The fifth target didn't behave like the others. It came up close, fast, moving laterally instead of standing still. A silhouette built to mimic something charging rather than something merely present. And Dara felt the range's difficulty curve announce itself the way a held breath announces a held breath. And she led it by half a body length and put the round through where its chest would be in another quarter second. The exact spot it actually was by the time the round arrived, and the target folded and the range went quiet. Nobody at the observation glass said anything for a second. Then somebody, not Sana, someone Dara didn't know, said, very quietly, "That's a 94% difficulty curve. That's not a second-year drill. That's not even a fourth-year drill." And the murmur that followed had a different texture than the murmur from 2 days ago in the classroom. Less mockery in it. More the low, uneasy hum of people recalculating something they'd already decided they understood. Corin walked the line to check her work, target by target, and said nothing for a long moment, studying the impact points with the particular silence of someone whose professional expectations had just been quietly rearranged. "Where did you learn to do that?" she said finally. "The threat prioritization on 3 and 4, that is not range doctrine, that is not academy doctrine. That is a decision most cadets don't make correctly under simulation, let alone live. My grandmother used to run me through drills like it when I was a kid," Dara said. "Not with a rifle at that age. With a slingshot, cans on a fence line, one closer than the other, timed. She never told me why it mattered which one I hit first. She just made me do it until I stopped getting it wrong. She was training you." "I don't think she thought of it that way. I think she just thought a person ought to know how to be still and accurate at the same time, and that the two things needed practicing together or neither one was worth much." Dara set the rifle down, breech open, safe, exactly the way she'd been taught. She wasn't sentimental about it. It was just Tuesday. The warden had crossed the range floor without either of them noticing. That slow gliding walk that covered ground faster than it looked like it should, and stopped a respectful distance away, studying the 5 collapsed targets with the same unreadable stillness they brought to everything. "Instructor Corin," the warden said, "what was your honest assessment of Cadet Voss's combat aptitude before this morning?" Corin didn't hesitate, which Dara appreciated even as it stung a little. Competent, disciplined, unremarkable in a room full of species built for this. I would have rated her middle of her class year, possibly lower, on raw combat metrics. And now I would like to know what else her grandmother taught her that she considers ordinary, Corin said, because I suspect the list is longer than either of us has asked about. The warden turned that faceless gray head toward Dara, and though there was nothing there to read an expression from, something in the stillness had shifted again, the same slow deepening she'd felt in the annex the day before. "One trial does not confirm a classification," the warden said. "But it does something else which I did not expect it to do this quickly. It makes the classification plausible rather than merely alarming. There is a meaningful difference. Alarming invites fear. Plausible invites understanding." A pause. "We continue tomorrow. Composure under direct threat this time rather than distance marksmanship. I want to see what happens when the danger is close enough to touch." It was Asen Threll who answered that, from the observation glass, in a voice pitched to carry. The first thing he'd said since the classroom 2 days ago, and every cadet in the room turned to hear it. "Let it be me," he said. "Warden, if you want to test composure under direct threat, test it against something that actually wants to win. A ranged target doesn't hit back." The warden considered him for a long moment, that slow, patient stillness giving nothing away, and Dara found herself watching Corin's face instead, because Corin's face, for just a fraction of a second, did something that looked very much like worry aimed in Asen's direction rather than her own. "That," the warden said finally, "may be exactly the trial I need. Instructor Corin schedule a supervised sparring evaluation, full safety protocols. Cadet Threll, Cadet Voss tomorrow 0900 the main combat floor." A pause, and something in the baritone carried a warning that only Dara, watching closely, seemed to register as a warning at all. "And Cadet Threll, I would think carefully tonight about what you are volunteering for. The archive does not care about your pride. It only cares about what actually happens when the round is fired or the blow is thrown. I would suggest you prepare for either outcome, because I promise you, I have no idea which one you are about to get, and neither do you." Asen's mandibles clicked once, sharp, defiant, the sound of a cadet who had heard a warning and decided, the way cadets in every species eventually do, that it did not apply to him. Dara said nothing at all. She just picked her borrowed rifle back up, broke it down for cleaning the way her grandmother had taught her 100 times on a porch 100 light years away, and let the room's noise wash past her without needing to answer any of it, because there was nothing to say yet that tomorrow wouldn't say better. Compact Cultures was the one class on Dara's schedule that had nothing to do with weapons or trials at all, a mandatory survey course every cadet took regardless of track, and under ordinary circumstances, it was the closest thing to restful the week offered her, 90 minutes of listening to Professor Kelvash Adrin, an elderly, softly rumbling dreith with skin like cracked dry riverbed, lecture on the customs and histories of the Compact's 400-member and provisional worlds. That evening session, scheduled the night before the sparring match, was not restful at all, because Professor Adrin had chosen, apparently weeks in advance and with no idea what the timing would land on, to devote the lecture to what the syllabus listed simply as Emerging Species Case Study: Humanity. "Before Cadet Voss's classroom incident 3 days ago," Adrin said, addressing a lecture hall considerably fuller than its usual attendance, word having clearly spread that this particular lecture might now carry more weight than the syllabus had ever intended, "my research on humanity consisted, I will admit freely, of second-hand accounts from provisional status liaison staff, and a small handful of translated cultural artifacts your species delegation provided upon admission. I had prepared for tonight a fairly conventional lecture on human folklore, specifically the recurring pattern across many of your cultures of legendary warrior figures, described in surviving texts with what I assumed was significant exaggeration, beings of extraordinary endurance, individuals credited with holding fortified positions alone against overwhelming numbers. I had intended to discuss this as an interesting but unremarkable feature of early mythmaking, the sort every developing species seems to produce independently." He paused, and something in his slow, rumbling voice carried a note of genuine, scholarly discomfort. "I confess I no longer know how much of that lecture I still believe." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the hall, not unkind, and Dara felt several dozen eyes drift toward her without quite settling there, the particular sideways attention of a room curious but too polite, or too wary, to stare directly. "Cadet Voss," Adrin said, "I would not ordinarily put a student on the spot in this fashion, and you are under no obligation to answer. But since you are, at present, the single most direct source of information on human capability this lecture hall has ever had access to, I have on record a translated account describing a figure your culture calls, variously, a soldier who single-handedly delayed an entire company at a mountain pass for the better part of a day. I had planned to present it as myth. Should I still?" Dara considered the question for a moment, aware of the room's attention settling more fully on her now, and answered the way she'd learned to answer most things that week, plainly, without performance, because performance only ever invited more of the wrong kind of attention. "Depends which one you mean, Professor," she said. "We've got a few of those stories. Different countries, different wars, different mountains. Some of them are probably exaggerated the way any old story gets exaggerated in the retelling, but the pattern's not myth. Terrain that funnels an enemy down to a narrow front, one determined position, enough ammunition, and enough reason to hold it. That's not magic. That's just math a lot of my species has been willing to do the hard way when it mattered. We don't tell those stories because they're impossible. We tell them because the people involved usually didn't think what they were doing was remarkable at the time. Somebody else decided it was remarkable afterward and wrote it down. And if the position could not be held, if the numbers were simply too great, then you don't get a story, Dara said. You get a name on a list somewhere, and maybe nobody even writes that down properly either, because there wasn't anybody left standing at the end of it to tell the tale. I think that's probably true of most species history, Professor, not just mine. The stories that survive are the ones somebody lived to tell. Doesn't mean the ones that didn't survive weren't just as real. Audrin was quiet for a long moment, his cracked riverbed skin shifting slightly the way Dara had learned, meant Adreeth was thinking hard rather than merely pausing for effect. And when he spoke again, the rumble in his voice had softened into something closer to genuine respect than academic curiosity. I believe, he said, I will be rewriting a considerable portion of tomorrow's lecture as well. Thank you, Cadet Voss. That is, I think, the most useful answer this course has received from a student in the 11 years I have taught it. He turned back to the projected display, where an old translated illustration of a lone figure at a mountain pass still hung, and added, half to the class and half, Dara suspected to himself. I confess I find myself wondering now how many other files in this compact's archive we have all simply agreed to call myth, rather than take the trouble of asking the one remaining question that actually matters. Not whether it happened, only whether anyone ever bothered to check. The combat floor filled up faster than the range annex had. By 0840, the observation gallery ringing the main floor was standing room only. Cadets from 3 class years pressed against the rail, word of the classroom incident having had 2 full days to spread itself into every corner of the academy. Sana got there early enough to claim a rail spot directly across from the mat, and when Dara caught her eye across the floor, her roommate didn't smile, didn't wave, just gave one small, steady nod that said everything a whole speech might have tried to. Asen Threll was already stretching when Dara arrived, working through a warm-up sequence that showed off exactly what a Keithrani warrior caste body was built for: dense muscle laid over a natural exoskeleton along the shoulders and forearms, a reach advantage of nearly half a meter, mandibles that could, Dara had been told more than once, exert enough closing pressure to shear through composite plating in a controlled bite. He was not, by any measure that mattered on paper, a fair matchup for a human cadet 2 years his junior in coursework. He also, Dara noted, hadn't slept well. It showed in the particular stiffness of his warm-up, the way his eyes kept flicking toward the gallery instead of staying on his own footwork, the way a person moves when they've spent a night arguing with themselves about whether volunteering for something was bravery or a mistake, and haven't landed on an answer yet. Full safety protocols, Instructor Corin said, standing between them at center mat, her voice carrying to the gallery without effort. Impact dampening active on both combatants. First submission, first disqualifying strike, or my call ends the bout. This is an evaluation, not a grudge match. Am I understood? Understood, Dara said. Asen didn't answer right away. He was looking at her, really looking, the way he hadn't in the mess hall queue, the way he hadn't since the classroom, and whatever he found in her face wasn't fear, and Dara watched it cost him something to see that. Understood, he said finally, and it came out rougher than he probably meant it to. Corin stepped back. The warden stood at the gallery rail beside Sana, faceless and patient, and somewhere above them Dara caught a glimpse of gray robes she didn't recognize. A second oculari, or perhaps Dean Vask's aide. She couldn't tell from this angle and didn't have the attention to spare finding out. Corin raised one long silver hand. Begin. Asen came in fast, the way warrior caste Keithrani were trained to. Close the distance before the opponent's advantage, if they had one, could be brought to bear. Turn every fight into a fight at the range where his reach and his mass did the deciding. It was a good instinct. It had probably ended every sparring match he'd ever been in before this one. He crossed the mat in under a second and threw a controlled forward strike meant to end things early and cleanly. The kind of blow that, on a smaller opponent, simply ends the conversation. Dara wasn't there when it landed. She'd stepped half a pace to the outside of his lead shoulder instead of backing straight away from it. A small movement, almost lazy-looking. The kind of thing that only works if you've done it enough times that your body stops asking your brain for permission first. And Asen's strike went past her by a hand's width, overcommitted, his weight already carrying him a full stride further than he meant to go. She didn't hit him. She didn't need to. She simply redirected the shoulder that had already overextended itself, a small guiding pressure at exactly the wrong moment for him, and Asen Threll's own momentum put him on the mat, hard, a full body length past where he'd meant to stop. The gallery went very quiet. He came up fast. Keithrani pride ran deep, deeper than good sense sometimes. Dara had learned that much in 3 years and came at her again, angrier this time, less controlled. A wide sweeping strike meant to close off her retreat entirely. This time she didn't step outside it. She stepped inside, close enough that his reach advantage evaporated entirely, close enough that his own strike carried past her shoulder with nothing behind it, and her free hand found the inside of his elbow and turned it, not violently, just precisely, the exact angle a joint doesn't want to travel. And Asen Threll went down a second time with a controlled grunt of surprise rather than pain, his forearm locked flat against the mat. Her knee planted lightly at the junction of his shoulder, and his exoskeletal plate, not pressing, just present, just there, the unmistakable geometry of a fight that had already ended. Submission, Corin called, and the impact dampeners cut whatever tension had been building in the room like a switch thrown. And Dara stepped back and offered Asen a hand up, which after a long, visibly difficult second he took. The gallery didn't erupt into noise the way a normal match might have. It stayed quiet, that same unsettled quiet from the classroom 2 days before, dozens of cadets from a dozen species recalculating the same thing at once, not the human won a sparring match, which happened occasionally and meant little, but the specific manner of it, the total absence of struggle in how she'd done it, the sense that they had just watched someone solve a math problem rather than fight a fight. Asen stood there for a moment, breathing hard, his mandibles working slowly, and Dara braced herself for the version of this she'd seen play out with other proud losers before, the deflection, the excuse, the this doesn't count because of X it didn't come. Instead he looked at her for a long moment and then, low enough that it didn't carry past the two of them, he said, "You never hit me once." "Didn't need to." "That is somehow worse." He rolled his shoulder, testing the joint she'd locked, wincing slightly. "My whole life I have been taught that a Keithrani who closes distance first wins the fight. Every instructor, every drill, every match since I was old enough to stand upright." He looked at her, mandibles still, something working behind his dark compound eyes that looked almost like the beginning of a different kind of respect than the one he'd have earned by winning. "You made closing the distance the mistake. I have never once considered that closing the distance could be the mistake. It's not usually. Against most things your size, it's exactly right." Dara picked up the water bottle Sana had thrown onto the mat edge for her, unscrewed it, didn't drink yet. "It's only wrong against something that's already decided where you're going to be before you get there." Asen looked at her for a long moment, and something in his posture, the aggressive forward set of his shoulders, the performative bristle he'd worn like armor for 18 months, eased, just slightly, into something closer to plain curiosity. "Your grandmother taught you that too." My grandmother taught me most things I know how to do with my hands. Dara finally drank. She'd have liked you, I think. She didn't respect people who backed down from a fight. She just thought most people picked the wrong fight to have. He didn't have an answer for that. He nodded once, short, and walked off the mat toward the locker corridor without another word, and Dara watched him go and thought, not for the first time this week, that the hardest part of all this wasn't proving anything to the aliens who'd never believed in her. It was going to be figuring out what to do with the ones who'd just started to. The warden was waiting at the gallery rail when she looked up, that faceless gray stillness giving away nothing and, somehow, giving away everything at once. Composure under direct threat, the warden said, once the gallery had begun to thin. Confirmed and confirmed in a manner I did not entirely anticipate. You did not merely survive Cadet Threll's aggression. You used it against him with what I can only describe as economy, the minimum force necessary, applied with what appears to be instinctive precision, without a moment of hesitation or doubt at any point in the exchange. A pause, that slow shifting beneath gray skin. That economy, Cadet Voss, is the second matching data point against your grandmother's account. She too, by her own record, expended the minimum necessary force to end an engagement decisively. 3 shots. No wasted motion. No panic in the writing, even 80 years removed from the moment. Is that good or bad? It is data, the warden said. I have stopped pretending to you or to myself that I know yet whether this ends well for your species review or badly. I only know that every trial so far points the same direction, and I have learned across a very long professional life to trust a pattern once it repeats itself 3 times independently. We are at 2. A pause. Tomorrow we go for the 3rd, and I suspect it will be the trial that tells us the most, because it will ask you to do something with nothing at all, the exact circumstance your grandmother found herself in, minus the part where anyone's life is actually at risk. Report to the Survival Annex, 0700. Bring only yourself. Dean Vask's aide, the one Dara had glimpsed among the gray robes at the gallery rail, was waiting outside the combat floor when she left, and delivered, in the careful, over-polished tone of someone repeating a message word for word rather than paraphrasing it, a summons of her own. The dean requested her presence that evening briefly, before the day's trials continued. Something in the aide's flat black eyes suggested the request had less to do with congratulations than with damage control, and Dara walked toward the administrative wing already composing, in her head, the calm and unbothered answers she suspected she was about to need. Dean Vask's office looked different at end of day, the dockship view outside the windows gone the deep blue-black of station night cycle, and Vask himself was not alone this time. A second figure occupied the far chair, small and sharp-featured, skin a mottled green-gray, wearing the layered formal collar of a compact council liaison, a species Dara didn't immediately recognize, though the collar told her enough about rank to keep her spine straight walking in. Cadet Voss, Vask said. This is Liaison Corps Meskin attached to the Council's review committee. She arrived this afternoon, somewhat ahead of the formal review schedule, once word of your trials reached the Council chamber. Meskin studied Dara with small, quick eyes that moved like they were cataloging rather than observing. 2 trials in 2 days, she said, without preamble. A marksmanship evaluation exceeding 4th-year difficulty curves, and a sparring bout in which you disabled a warrior caste cadet without landing a single offensive strike. Both witnessed by dozens of students. Both, I am told, now the subject of considerable discussion across 3 class years. She folded her hands. You understand why this concerns the review committee. Because it makes humans look dangerous, Dara said. Because it makes humans look unpredictable, Meskin corrected, sharp and precise. Dangerous, the Council can plan around. Every species in this compact is dangerous in some fashion. That is why weapons exist, why academies exist. Unpredictable is different. Unpredictable means we do not know what we are actually reviewing when we review your world. Is it a species of competent soldiers, which is manageable? Or is it a species that produces, apparently without particular effort, individuals capable of matching an archive classification the compact has not confirmed in living memory? Those are very different admissions to make to a council that has spent 3 years being told the former. I didn't ask to match the classification, Dora said. I brought my grandmother's rifle to a class because it was the only weapon I own that I actually trust. Everything since then has been other people deciding what that means. I am aware, Meskin said, and something in her tone eased fractionally into something almost sympathetic. I am not here to blame you, Cadet Voss. I am here because in 9 days I report to the full council on Earth's provisional status, and as of this afternoon, the single largest variable in that report is you. I would like to understand what I am actually reporting, rather than guessing at it from a gallery rail. That's what the warden's trials are for. The warden's trials will produce an archive finding, Meskin said. They will not produce a political one. Those are not the same thing, and I suspect you already know that, because you strike me as someone who understands the difference between what is true and what people decide to do about what is true. She stood, smoothing her formal collar, and for a moment the sharp cataloging quality left her eyes entirely, replaced by something more tired, more human than Dara expected from a species that wasn't. I have sat on this committee for 11 years, Cadet Voss. I have watched species admitted, species rejected, species placed under indefinite probation for reasons that had very little to do with actual danger, and a great deal to do with fear the council members were too proud to name honestly. I do not yet know which of those futures your species is walking toward. I would like it to be the first one. I am not certain the council shares that preference by default, which is why I am telling you plainly off any formal record. Whatever the warden's trials find, the manner in which you carry yourself through them will matter to this committee nearly as much as the findings themselves. Calm, cooperative, unbothered by provocation, including provocation from me. A faint, dry, almost smile. You have been so far, continue. She left without another word, her aide falling into step behind her, and Vask waited until the door had fully closed before letting out a breath that carried, for the first time since Dara had met him, something that sounded almost like genuine strain. She is, for what it's worth, one of the more reasonable members of that committee, Vask said. There are others who will read tomorrow's trial report looking only for reasons to be afraid. I cannot control that. I can only tell you what I told you 2 days ago. Stay calm, stay visible, and do not give them a version of you that confirms the fear rather than the fact. He paused, and something in his flat black eyes shifted, the same fractional worry that wasn't quite worry she'd caught from him before. For what it is worth, Cadet Voss, I watched the sparring recording twice. He didn't elaborate further and didn't need to. The survival annex the next morning was nothing like the gray gleam of the rest of the academy. A sealed biome dome 300 meters across, built to simulate a dozen hostile terrain profiles for field training purposes, currently configured, per the warden's specification, for a stretch of cold, broken hill country that looked, disorientingly, almost exactly like the high country behind her grandmother's property, right down to the particular gray-green of the simulated scrub brush. 12 hours, the warden said, standing at the dome's entry lock beside Corin, who looked less than thrilled about the whole arrangement and hadn't hidden it. No equipment beyond what you're wearing. No food. No water beyond what the terrain provides. Your task is simple to state and, I am told, considerably less simple to accomplish. Reach the marker beacon at the dome's far ridge, on foot, before the cycle ends. The terrain is not empty. It is seeded with simulated hazards calibrated to test resourcefulness rather than combat, nothing that can genuinely harm you, but plenty that will convince your body otherwise if you make the wrong choice. Why 12 hours for a walk across a dome? Dara asked. Because it is not a walk, the warden said. It is 11 kilometers of broken terrain, a simulated cold front arriving at hour 6, and a dry stretch with no accessible water for the first 4 hours regardless of route. Most cadets who attempt this configuration, and it has been attempted by senior-year survival specialists under considerably better conditions than the ones I have configured for you, require the full allotment and arrive at the marker in poor condition. I am not testing whether you finish, Cadet Voss. I am testing how you finish. Your grandmother's account describes a woman who improvised under pressure with no visible panic, using minimal resources to solve an immediate problem, and then continuing on as though nothing extraordinary had happened. I would like to see whether that is a family trait, or whether it was a single moment of luck 80 years removed from anyone who can verify it firsthand. Corin stepped closer as the warden moved off to check the dome's calibration, her silver face drawn tight in a way Dara hadn't seen before. "This is a genuinely hard evaluation," she said, low. "I've run cadets through this configuration. Some of them didn't finish. One required medical extraction in year 1 before I adjusted the calibration down for standard coursework. The warden set it back to the original difficulty for you." "I noticed. You don't seem worried about that." Dara looked out through the dome's viewing port at the simulated hill country beyond, the gray-green scrub, the cold, thin light of a projected sun climbing toward a projected noon, and thought about 11 years old, 6 miles from the nearest neighbor, being handed a canteen and a knife, and told to find her own way back to the house by dark, because a person who couldn't do that at 11 wasn't going to manage it at 20. "My grandmother used to send me out on the ridge alone for a whole afternoon at a time when I was a kid," Dara said. "No phone, no trail markers. Just figure it out, be home by dark, don't come crying if you get turned around." She rolled her shoulders, testing the give in the borrowed field jacket the annex had issued her. "I hated it for about a year. Then I stopped hating it because I got good enough at it that it stopped being scary. I think that was the point the whole time." "That's an unusual way to raise a child." She wasn't raising a child for a world where somebody else was always going to be there to help her, Dara said. "I didn't understand that until about 4 days ago. I think I understand it a lot better now." The lock cycled open, and the cold, dry, projected air of the dome rolled out to meet her, and Dara stepped through it without looking back, because looking back had never once gotten her grandmother's rifle loaded any faster, and it wasn't going to get this ridge crossed any faster either. The first 4 hours were, mostly, exactly as advertised: dry, broken ground, no water, the kind of terrain that punished a wasted step more than it punished a slow one. Dara kept her pace even, conserved what little moisture her body carried, and read the land the way her grandmother had taught her to read it, watching for the particular green of vegetation that meant water close to the surface, even when no water was visible, watching the angle of what light there was, keeping the ridge line always in the corner of her eye, so she never had to stop and reorient from scratch. By hour 3 she'd found a seep at the base of a rock shelf that the terrain generator clearly hadn't expected a second-year cadet to locate this early. The dome's hazard log, the warden would tell her later, had flagged her position with visible surprise, an automated note logged simply as unexpected route efficiency, and she drank what she needed and kept moving. The simulated cold front arrived at hour 6 exactly on schedule, dropping the dome's projected temperature fast enough that she felt it in her hands before she felt it anywhere else. And this was the part the annex's difficulty curve had clearly been built around. No shelter marked on any obvious path, the terrain narrowing into a stretch of exposed rock with nowhere soft enough to dig in, and nothing standing tall enough to break the wind. Most cadets, Corin had said, spent this stretch losing time, backtracking, searching for shelter that wasn't there. Dara didn't backtrack. She found a shallow fold in the rock face, angled away from the wind's projected vector, and built what her grandmother would have called a poor man's lean-to out of dead scrub brush and her own field jacket stretched taut between 2 low outcrops. Not warm, not comfortable, but enough to break the worst of the wind, while she waited out the front's leading edge rather than fighting through open exposure at full strength. It cost her 40 minutes she hadn't planned to spend. It saved her, by the dome's own internal metrics, nearly 2 hours of reduced efficiency she would otherwise have burned pushing directly into the wind. She crossed the marker beacon at the base of the far ridge with 3 hours and 20 minutes still on the clock, cold, dry-mouthed hands scraped from the rock shelf, and entirely, unmistakably, still herself. No stagger in her step, no wild-eyed relief, just the flat, tired satisfaction of a job finished the way it was supposed to be finished. The warden was waiting at the marker when the dome's exit lock cycled, along with Corin and, unexpectedly, Sana, who broke every rule about observer distance to close the last few meters at something close to a run and grip Dara's shoulder hard enough to leave a mark. 3 hours early, Sana said. 3 hours. Route efficiency, water location, and shelter improvisation all rated in the archive's historical top percentile for this configuration, the warden said, and there was, for the first time since Dara had met them, something in that faceless stillness that read unmistakably like genuine astonishment. Cadet Voss, I have run this exact evaluation in various forms for 11 years of compact service prior to my archive posting. I have never once seen it completed with time remaining that could be measured in hours rather than minutes. A pause, that slow shifting beneath gray skin resuming, thoughtful, weighing something. We are at 3 confirmed data points now: marksmanship, composure under direct threat, resourcefulness under deprivation. Every single one consistent, independently. With your grandmother's 80-year-old account of a night in a pasture, I am increasingly certain, was not an ordinary night at all. So what happens now? Dara said, wrapping her scraped hands around the water flask Corin pressed into them without ceremony. Now, the warden said, the Deep Archive Search Records technician Farron began 4 days ago should finally be returning results. And I believe, Cadet Voss, that it is time we found out exactly what your grandmother actually fought that night, and why an entity 3 separate times more dangerous than anything currently cataloged in this compact's threat archive apparently took one look at 3 armed intruders and 1 girl with a bolt-action rifle, and decided the girl was the one worth marking down as unmanageable. Records technician Farron was waiting for them back in the annex, gray face gone a full shade paler than Dara remembered from 4 days earlier. 3 data slates arranged in front of them on the console like evidence at a trial. Nobody had officially convened yet. I need to preface this, Farron said, before anyone had fully settled, by saying that what I found is not currently taught in any academy curriculum, is not widely known outside senior archive staff, and is, in my professional opinion, going to make several council members extremely uncomfortable. They glanced at the warden, who gave the smallest possible gesture of permission, and continued. The archive's alpha predator classification tier predates the compact itself. It was inherited wholesale from an earlier cataloging system, maintained by an organization called the Scarrow Concord, which the compact formally dissolved and absorbed 140 years ago. Dissolved for what? Corin asked. Illegal harvest operations, Farron said, and the clinical flatness of the phrase did nothing to soften what it meant. The Concord operated for roughly 3 centuries as a licensing body for what it called controlled wildlife acquisition on unlisted worlds, worlds that hadn't yet been surveyed, cataloged, or brought under any compact protection, which under the old pre-compact charter meant, functionally, worlds with no standing to object to what happened on them. Trophy extraction. Live specimen capture for private collections, and for what the Concord's own records euphemistically called exhibition purposes. They rated every world they harvested using a threat tier system almost identical to the one this archive still uses today, because when the compact dissolved the Concord, it inherited their entire catalog rather than build a new one from scratch. Most of the tier structure survived the transition unchanged, including, apparently, the top tier. You're telling me Alpha Predator isn't a threat rating, Dara said slowly. It's a poacher's rating. It is both, in the sense that both things can be true of the same phrase, Farron said. To the conquered, an Alpha Predator classification meant a target species too costly to harvest safely, one where the extraction crews sent to acquire specimens did not come back, or came back without the specimens, or came back having lost enough of the crew that the operation was written off as a loss and the world in question flagged, permanently, do not attempt again. It is not a compliment in their system. It is a business decision. But functionally, in practice, on the ground, it meant exactly what it means in the modern archive. Something that fought back and won, every time, with no recorded exception. The warden had gone very still, that slow shifting beneath gray skin arrested entirely, listening. Continue, they said. The specific entry matching Cadet Voss's weapon signature is dated to a conquered harvest attempt logged 81 Earth Standard years ago, Farron said, pulling the record up on the central display, an old scan of a document in a script none of them recognized, translated in a scrolling column beside it. A 3-person extraction crew, dispatched under a valid Concord license, targeting an unlisted world cataloged at the time only by coordinate designation. A world that, cross-referenced against Cadet Voss's stated location, is Earth. The crew's mission brief specifies capture of local apex terrestrial fauna for a private collector's commission. Specifically, Farron hesitated, and for the first time since Dara had met them, looked almost apologetic. Specifically humans. The crew's own preliminary survey had flagged the species as an ideal specimen. Bipedal, intelligent enough to be an interesting exhibit, technologically primitive enough by Concord standards to be assumed containable with standard net-and stasis capture equipment. Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. Dara felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the survival dome's simulated cold front. They were going to put humans in a collection, she said, like animals. That was the Concord's business model for 3 centuries. Cadet Voss and Earth was, by pure accident of unlisted status, an eligible target, Farron said, gently. The crew's final transmission, sent moments before contact, was lost entirely, logged a stasis box malfunction consistent with catastrophic damage. Your grandmother's account describes putting the first round through, in her words, the box, because the humming bothered her. That box was the capture apparatus. Destroying it stripped the crew of their entire means of safely subduing or transporting a specimen. The 2 crew members who then closed distance on her were not, by Concord training doctrine, expecting resistance capable of ending the operation. Their standard doctrine for this classification of world assumed technologically primitive meant tactically primitive. They were not prepared for a 16-year-old girl who could reload a bolt-action rifle without looking at her hands. 16, Corin said quietly. She was 16 years old. According to the record Cadet Voss provided, yes. Farron pulled up the final panel, the Concord crew's own closing entry, logged by whichever member of the party had escaped. The 4th shape Etta Voss had never seen leave. It was short. It had clearly been filed in a hurry by someone who had not stayed to confirm anything further. Operation aborted. Extraction team lost, presumed neutralized. Recommend immediate reclassification of target world to Concord Tier 0. Do not attempt further contact, harvest, or survey without full military escort. Apex indigenous defense capability exceeds all pre-mission threat modeling by an order of magnitude the survey team cannot account for. World flagged. File closed. The warden read the entry twice. That faceless gray head bowed slightly toward the display, and when they finally spoke, the calm baritone had gone quieter than Dara had heard it yet. Cadet Voss, the warden said, your grandmother did not simply survive an attack 81 years ago. She single-handedly ended an entire species candidacy for harvest under a licensing system that had, by that point, successfully extracted specimens from over 400 worlds without a single recorded failure of this magnitude. The Scarrow conquered its own internal records, which the compact inherited and has maintained, largely unexamined for a century and a half, classify your world, and by extension your species, as the single most consequential defensive failure in the Concord's operating history. Not because you are monstrous. Because you were underestimated, catastrophically, by an organization that had grown lazy on 400 easy worlds, and the first hard world it met ended the operation in under a minute with a weapon it hadn't even bothered to survey seriously. A pause. The classification your rifle carries is not a threat assessment of what humanity is capable of doing to others. It is a record of what humanity did once to people who came to do something unforgivable to you and did not expect to be stopped. Dara looked at the old translated document, at a dead crew's own hurried words. Apex indigenous defense capability exceeds all pre-mission threat modeling, and thought of her grandmother at 16, alone on a ridge at night with a rifle and a bad feeling about a light in the sky, never telling a living soul, cleaning that same rifle every spring for 61 years because some things you keep ready and don't ask questions of twice. She never told anyone, Dara said quietly, not because she was ashamed, because she thought no one would believe her and she was probably right. She was entirely right, the warden said. Which means, Cadet Voss, that for 81 years this compact has carried a classification in its deepest archive with no context attached to it at all, a flag, a warning, a fear with the actual story stripped clean out of it. Fear without context is precisely how species get denied membership review, or worse. I intend to make certain that does not happen here, but I will need your help doing it, one final time, and I will need it in front of the full council rather than in this annex. The warden turned toward Farron. Prepare the full record for formal tribunal presentation. Every document, cross-referenced, verified twice. I want no ambiguity left for anyone in that chamber to hide behind. When Corin asked, 3 days, the warden said. The council review was already moved forward once word of Cadet Voss's trials reached the committee. I do not think we will be granted a 4th day to prepare, and I do not think, having seen what I have seen this week, that we need one. The 3 days before the tribunal did not feel like preparation so much as they felt like waiting for whether nobody could see yet, but everyone could feel building. Dara kept to her restricted schedule, kept her hands busy, kept her face steady in the mess hall and the corridors, and the one additional evaluation the warden insisted on squeezing in, a field strip and reassembly of the borrowed bolt action, done blind, timed, in front of a small panel of Academy weapons instructors who had heard enough rumor by now to show up early and say very little once they arrived. She broke the rifle down and put it back together in the dark in under 90 seconds, the way her grandmother had made her do it 100 times on the back porch as a girl, muttering that a weapon you couldn't trust with your eyes closed wasn't a weapon you should trust at all. And when the lights came back up, one of the instructors, an older Ithran Dara didn't know, close to Corin's own seniority, simply nodded once and left without comment. Which by now she'd learned was the loudest thing anyone on the station knew how to say. There was one more evaluation squeezed into that first day, one the warden hadn't announced in advance, which Dara suspected was deliberate. A written tactical assessment, administered without warning by a visiting proctor from the Academy's strategy department, the kind of exam every combat track cadet dreaded, because it measured a different muscle entirely than a rifle range or a sparring mat. 40 scenario problems, escalating complexity, a strict 2-hour clock, the kind of exam that senior cadets talked about in low, cautionary tones for weeks before they sat it. No cadet in this Academy's recorded history has finished all 40 problems inside the 2-hour window, the proctor said, a clipped, precise Threnna with a habit of tapping her stylus against the desk between sentences. The record stands at 31, set 4 years ago by a cadet who went on to Academy honors. I say this not to discourage you, Cadet Voss, but so you understand what a reasonable outcome looks like today. Do not panic if the clock runs out before you do. Dara didn't panic. She read the first problem, a supply convoy pinned between two hostile positions with insufficient fuel to retreat by either route, and solved it the way she'd solved everything else that week, breaking it down into what she actually had rather than what she wished she had, and moved to the second problem before she'd fully finished congratulating herself on the first. The scenarios kept coming: ambush geometry, resource triage under a ticking supply clock, a hostage extraction with two incompatible extraction windows, and somewhere around problem 20 she stopped consciously tracking the time at all and simply worked, the way her grandmother used to work a fence line in autumn, steady, unhurried, one post at a time until the whole run was done. She set her stylus down, with 11 minutes still showing on the clock. The proctor's practiced composure slipped for just a moment as she scanned the completed answer sheet. Stylus tapping stopped mid-motion. "All 40, she said, more to herself than to Dara, in an hour and 49 minutes. She looked up, recalculating something behind her sharp Threnna eyes. "I would like to review your reasoning on problem 36 before I score this. Your solution does not match the answer key. It is, as far as I can tell reading it just now, considerably better than the answer key." The convoy commander in that scenario had already lost 2 vehicles by the time the question describes, Dara said. The answer key wanted a rescue plan for the convoy. I wrote an evacuation plan for the survivors instead, because by the time you're asking that question, the convoy isn't a convoy anymore. It's just people who need to get somewhere safer than where they are. Doesn't help anybody to keep planning around a resource that's already gone. The proctor didn't say anything for a long moment, and then wrote something brief in the margin of the scoring sheet, and did not, this time, tell Dara what a reasonable outcome looked like, because it was already clear neither of them needed reminding. Asen Threll found her in the mess hall on the second evening, tray in hand, and instead of walking past with his eyes forward the way he'd been doing all week, he sat down across from her without asking, which for a Keithrani warrior caste cadet was its own small act of surrender. "I requested to speak at the tribunal," he said without preamble, "in your favor. Corin said I needed your permission first, since it's your review, not mine." Dara set down her fork. "Why?" "Because I have spent 4 days telling myself the sparring match was a fluke, or a trick, or bad luck on my part, and every version of that story fell apart the moment I actually thought it through honestly." He set his own tray down harder than necessary, mandibles working. "You did not beat me because you were strong. You are not strong, by any measure my species uses. You beat me because you understood exactly what I was going to do before I did it, and you let my own strength be the thing that failed me. That is not luck. That is not a fluke. That is a species that has apparently been training its children to think that way since before they can hold a weapon properly, and nobody on this council has bothered to ask what that actually means before deciding whether to be afraid of it." He looked at her, steady, none of the old performative bristle left in it. "I do not think you are dangerous, Cadet Voss. I think you are the most disciplined cadet in this academy. And I think this station has spent 3 years mistaking your species' quiet for weakness, because none of us have ever had to be quiet about anything a day in our lives. I would like to say that in front of the council, if you'll let me." Dara studied him for a moment, the same cadet who'd called her rifle a joke 5 days ago, mandibles clicking with amusement in a room full of people laughing along, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she believed every word of what he'd just said. "Say it," she said, "but say it because it's true, not because you feel guilty about the mat." "Both things can be true at once," Asen said, and for the first time since she'd known him, something that might almost have been a smile moved through his mandibles. "My people are not opposed to admitting when we were wrong, Cadet Voss. We are only opposed to admitting it slowly. Instructor Corin, when Dara found her afterward to relay the offer, took it with less surprise than Dara expected. He came to me first, 2 days ago, before he'd worked up the nerve to say it to you directly, Corin said. I told him the same thing I'm telling you now. The council will weigh a Keith Ronnie cadet's testimony on your behalf more heavily than you might expect, precisely because his species doesn't offer that kind of concession easily. Use it, not because it's convenient, because it happens to also be true, and truth carries weight in that chamber that flattery never will. Dean Vask's part in the 3 days was smaller, quieter, and Dara came to realize, considerably more difficult for him than anything he let show on his face. She found out only secondhand, through Sana, who'd heard it from a cadet whose parent worked academy administration, that Vask had spent the better part of 2 days fielding calls from council members demanding he preemptively suspend her, expel her, or at minimum bar her from the tribunal proceedings entirely on the grounds that a cadet under active threat classification review posed an unacceptable liability to the institution's standing. He had refused all 3 requests, each time in writing on record, in a way that would follow him personally if the tribunal went badly. She thanked him for it, briefly, the one time their paths crossed in the administrative corridor the morning before the hearing. Don't thank me yet, Vask said, and there was something almost wry in it, the closest to humor she'd ever heard from him. I have not done this because I am certain how the tribunal will resolve, Cadet Voss. I have done it because I have read every trial report from this week twice, and because I sat through the sparring recording a 3rd time last night, and because somewhere in that process I stopped being able to convince myself that suspending you would be procedure rather than cowardice. He straightened his collar, a small, formal, deflecting gesture. I would still very much like this to go well tomorrow. For the Academy's sake, and I find, somewhat to my own surprise, for yours. The one figure Dara did not hear from in all 3 days was Overseer Voth Amaral, a name that surfaced first through Liaison Meskin's careful, warning tone during a brief comm check the night before the hearing, and then again through the tribunal's published docket, which listed him as presiding senior council member for the session. He is the reason this was moved forward 3 days early, Meskin told her, her sharp small eyes steady through the comm display. He sits on the council's military oversight committee, and he has spent the better part of 2 decades arguing that the compact's expansion policy admits species faster than it can properly vet them. Your classification, Cadet Voss, is the strongest evidence he has been handed in his entire tenure. I do not say this to frighten you. I say it because Amaral does not raise his voice, does not bluster, does not perform outrage the way some council members do when they want to seem forceful. He asks quiet, precise questions, and he is very good at finding the one answer that unravels an entire argument if you are not careful how you give it. A pause and something almost gentle crept into her clipped tone. Answer him the way you've answered everyone else this week, plainly, without flourish. It has worked so far. I see no reason it will stop working tomorrow, provided you do not let him rattle you into offering more than the truth requires. Dara thanked her, ended the comm, and sat for a long while on the edge of her bunk with the ledger scan open on her slate one more time, reading her grandmother's cramped, stubborn handwriting by the dim gray approximation of earth dusk the station gave her, and thought that if Etta Voss could stand alone on a ridge at 16 with 3 strangers closing in and a rifle she trusted more than her own fear, then her granddaughter could certainly manage one council chamber, however many quiet, precise questions waited for her inside it. Overseer Amaral himself contacted her only once before the hearing, late on the final evening, through a formal comm request routed directly to her slate rather than through any staff intermediary. Unusual enough, Corin told her afterward that it likely meant he wanted to see her answer with no one coaching it. His small dark face filled the display without preamble, without greeting, exactly as dry and unhurried as he'd been in every second-hand account she'd heard of him. Cadet Voss, he said, I am told it is customary, before a tribunal of this significance, for the presiding overseer to offer the subject one piece of advice, off record, before the formal session. I do not know if that custom applies to provisional species review cases specifically. I am extending it to you regardless, because I find myself, against considerable professional habit, curious about you. I'm listening, Overseer. Tomorrow, several members of this council will attempt to provoke you, Amaral said. Not out of malice particularly, though some will enjoy it more than they should. They will do it because fear responds predictably to provocation, and if your species' calm this past week has been a performance rather than a genuine trait, provocation is the fastest way to prove it. I have reviewed every trial report from this week twice. I do not believe it is a performance. I would like to be right about that tomorrow, in front of a chamber that will remember whichever answer they get. A pause, dry, precise. My advice, such as it is, do not try to win the room. Rooms like that one are not won. They are only, occasionally, convinced. There is a difference, and I suspect you already understand it better than most cadets your age would. Why tell me that, Dara said. You're the one they say wants us gone. I want this compact to survive its own expansion without being destroyed by species it admitted too quickly and understood too little, Amaral said. That is not the same accusation your gossip network has apparently made of me, though I imagine it makes for a tidier villain. I have opposed exactly 4 provisional memberships in 20 years of service, Cadet Voss, out of 11 that came before this council during my tenure. 2 of the 4 I opposed are today dissolved societies that turned that same unexamined capability inward on themselves within a decade of admission, exactly as I warned this council they might. I do not enjoy being right about that. I would very much prefer to be wrong about your species tomorrow. His dark eyes held hers through the display, unreadable, patient. Sleep, cadet. Whatever you are tomorrow, be it rested. The calm ended before she could answer, and Dara sat with the dark display for a long moment, turning his words over the unhurried way she'd learned to turn everything over that week, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she believed every word of it, not because it comforted her, but because it didn't try to. The council chamber was nothing like the classrooms and annexes Dara had spent the week inside. It sat near the Calyx Anchor's administrative core, a wide amphitheater ringed in tiered seating built to accommodate the full spread of compact anatomies, curved black stone underfoot polished to a shine that threw back the cold light of a dozen floating status displays. By the time Dara arrived, escorted this time not by security but by Corin and the warden together, the gallery was already full, cadets, instructors, a scattering of press liaisons from member worlds, and near the center of the raised dais, a long curved table where Overseer Voth Amaral sat waiting, small and dark-eyed and utterly still, the kind of stillness that read less like patience than like a predator that had already decided not to waste energy moving before it needed to. Liaison Meskin sat 2 seats down from him. Dean Vask occupied a lower tier, alone, his gray face composed into something carefully neutral. And near the gallery rail, close enough that Dara caught his eye the moment she stepped onto the chamber floor, sat Asen Threll, still in uniform, mandibles set in an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of steady. "This tribunal is convened," Amaral said, once the chamber had quieted, his voice a dry, unhurried instrument that carried without effort to every tier, to review an archive classification of unprecedented severity, produced during the provisional membership evaluation of the species designated human. Archivist Warden Ren Severeth will present findings. The subject cadet, Dara Voss, will be available for direct examination. Let the record show the council takes no position in advance of the evidence. A pause, dry as the rest of him. Proceed. The warden's presentation took the better part of an hour, and Dara had heard most of it already: the calibrator's reading, the 3 independent trials, Farron's deep archive dig into the Scarrow Concord's inherited catalog, the dissolved licensing system, the aborted extraction, the file closed. What she hadn't heard before was how it sounded laid end to end in front of a room full of strangers deciding her species' future, each piece landing with a weight the annex conversations hadn't quite carried, because there the warden had been thinking out loud with her. Here, they were building a case. Summary, the warden said, closing the presentation with the same unhurried calm they'd carried through every trial that week. The classification currently attached to Cadet Voss's weapon does not describe an unprovoked threat. It describes a documented act of self-defense against an illegal capture operation, conducted 81 years ago by an organization this compact itself dissolved and formally condemned for exactly this kind of conduct. The human species did not seek this classification. It was assigned to them, without their knowledge, by the very organization that attempted to victimize them, as a warning to its own operatives not to try again. I would ask this council to consider what conclusion it wishes to draw from that fact, that a species defended itself successfully once against an unlawful hunting party, and has apparently spent 81 years since then never speaking of it, never weaponizing it, never once attempting to leverage a classification they did not even know existed until 5 days ago. A generous reading, Amaral said, and the dryness in his voice sharpened just slightly. Archivist Warden, I do not dispute your findings regarding the Scarrow Concord's original licensing fraud. I dispute the conclusion you are inviting this council to draw from it. An entity capable of ending an armed extraction crew in under a minute, at 16 years of age, with no formal combat training, using an unassisted weapon, remains exactly that, an entity capable of doing so. Context explains why it happened. Context does not unhappen the capability. I would like to hear from the cadet directly. His small dark eyes shifted to Dara for the first time since the session began. Cadet Voss, step forward. Dara stepped to the center of the chamber floor, aware of every tier of seating angled down toward her, aware of Corin's steady presence at the edge of her vision, and Asen's stillness at the rail and the warden's faceless patience just behind her shoulder, and found, standing there, that the nerves she'd half expected simply weren't there. She had spent a week proving, one trial at a time, that calm was not a performance she put on for other people. It was just how she was built. Cadet, Amaral said, I will ask you a question, and I would like you to answer it honestly, without deflection. If this council determines today that your species poses an unacceptable risk and votes to revoke Earth's provisional status, effective immediately, permanent quarantine, no further contact, what would you do? The chamber went very quiet. Even Meskin, Dara noticed, leaned forward slightly, sharp eyes narrowing, waiting. I'd go home, Dara said. Amaral's dark eyes didn't move. That is all. That's all, Dara said. I didn't come here to conquer anything, Overseer. I came here because my species applied for membership, and I was one of 9 cadets selected to represent it, and I have spent 3 years trying to do that well. If the council decides we don't belong here, that's the council's decision to make, and I don't have the standing to argue with it by force, and I wouldn't want to even if I did. I'd go home, and I'd probably spend a long time wondering what exactly we did wrong, since as far as I can tell, the only thing we've actually done this whole review period is defend ourselves 81 years before anyone in this chamber was appointed to it. A convenient answer. It's the true one, Dara said, and something in her voice, flat and unhurried, carried further than she expected it to. You asked me to answer honestly instead of deflecting, so I did. I could tell you something that sounds more reassuring, Overseer, but I get the sense you'd see through that faster than you'd see through the truth, and I'd rather you see through nothing at all. A ripple moved through the gallery, not laughter, nothing so loose as that, but something that had the shape of surprise loosening into approval, quiet and quick and gone almost before it registered. Amaral's expression didn't change, but his stillness, Dara thought, shifted by some small fraction she couldn't name, the stillness of a man recalculating a variable he hadn't accounted for. "Let me ask differently then," he said. "Your grandmother killed 2 members of that extraction crew and destroyed their equipment, alone, at 16, without hesitation severe enough to be recorded in her own account. Do you believe you could do the same if the circumstance arose again?" Dara considered the question honestly, the way she'd learned to consider everything this week, before answering. "I don't know," she said. "I've never had to find out, and I hope I never do. But I'll tell you what I do know, Overseer, because I think it's a more useful answer than a guess about hypotheticals. I know that every trial this council has watched this week, I passed without hurting anyone who didn't choose to test me first. Cadet Threll asked to spar me. I didn't ask him. The range targets weren't alive. The survival dome didn't have a single creature in it I had to fight. Every single measurement your warden has taken of what I'm capable of this week has also been a measurement of what I chose not to do with it, every single time, because nobody gave me a reason to. My grandmother didn't either, until 3 strangers showed up with a net and a stasis box to take her like livestock. If that's the bar for Alpha Predator, Overseer, then I'd respectfully suggest the bar was never about how dangerous we are. It's about how dangerous we are when somebody leaves us no other choice. I don't think that's a flaw in my species. I think that's the exact quality every species sitting in this chamber would want in its own people, if the situation were reversed." Asen Threll stood up from the gallery rail before Amaral could respond, and the chamber's attention swung to him instead, a Keithrani warrior caste cadet on his feet without having been called. "Overseer, I request leave to speak," he said. "I was the cadet who sparred her. I asked for that evaluation myself publicly because I did not believe a human cadet could outfight me, and I wanted the council to see it happen so there would be no question of favoritism in the result." He paused, mandibles working once, and then continued steady. "She did not injure me. She did not need to. She ended the match with the minimum force required to make her point, and not one measure more, against an opponent with every physical advantage species biology could give him. I have spent 5 days trying to find a version of that fight where she was the dangerous one in the room, Overseer, and I cannot find it. The only dangerous thing I saw on that mat was my own certainty that strength alone should have been enough to win. It wasn't. That is not a threat to this compact. That is a lesson this compact has apparently needed for longer than any of us realized." Instructor Corin rose next, unbidden, without waiting to be recognized, which for an Ithran who had spent 11 years teaching cadets the value of proper procedure was its own quiet statement. "Overseer, I have taught arms trials long enough to have watched a great many cadets, from a great many species, react to being underestimated," she said. "Most react to it. They perform confidence, or they nurse the grievance, or they overcorrect and become exactly the threat everyone feared in the first place, simply to prove a point. Cadet Voss did none of those things, not once, across a week that would have justified any of them. I do not offer that as sentiment, Overseer. I offer it as a professional's assessment. Whatever this council decides today about a classification 81 years old, the cadet standing in front of you has already demonstrated, under more scrutiny than any student I have taught in a decade, exactly the temperament this compact should want in a member species. I would ask the council to weigh that alongside the archive record, not instead of it." Amaral was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes moving slowly from Asen to Dara to the warden's patient, faceless stillness, and when he finally spoke again, some of the dry sharpness had gone out of his voice, replaced by something more careful. "Archivist Warden," he said, "in your professional judgment, not the council's, yours, does this classification, properly understood, constitute grounds to deny or revoke Earth's provisional status?" "No," the warden said, without a flicker of hesitation. "It constitutes grounds to correct 81 years of an unexamined record, and to formally close the file the Scarrow conquered left open on this world, not as a threat classification requiring caution, But as a closed case requiring an apology, this compact is a century and a half overdue in delivering. I would go further, Overseer, and say this tribunal has an opportunity today that very few tribunals are given, to demonstrate, on the full council record, that this compact can encounter difficult evidence about a member species and choose understanding over fear. I would ask you to take that opportunity. I do not often make requests of this council. I am making one now. The vote, when it came, was not close. Dara learned later that it carried by a margin wide enough that even Amaral's own oversight committee split against him. And the formal language of the ruling, read aloud by Meskin in a voice that had lost every trace of its earlier caution, closed Earth's Scarrow conquered file permanently, reclassified the archive entry from Alpha Predator to a new administrative tier, the council created on the spot, translated loosely as verified self-defense. No further action, and recommended, in a unanimous secondary motion Dara hadn't expected at all, that Earth's provisional status be reviewed not for revocation but for early advancement. On the grounds that a species capable of the restraint demonstrated this week deserved to be trusted with more rather than less. Amaral did not smile, did not offer congratulations, did not soften in any visible way as the chamber began to empty. But as Dara turned to leave the floor, he said one thing, quiet enough that only she and the warden standing close by caught it. "I asked you what you would do if we sent you home, Cadet Voss," he said. "I have sat on this council for 2 decades, and I have never once received an answer to that question that I believed completely. I believed yours." He paused, dark eyes unreadable. "That, for what it is worth, is the actual reason my vote changed, not the archive record. You—" He left without waiting for a response, which by now Dara understood was simply how difficult men on this station said the closest thing to a compliment they knew how to give. They returned the rifle to her 3 days later, in a small administrative office rather than the wide council chamber, which suited Dara considerably better than a second audience would have. Dean Vask handled the formalities himself, laying the rifle across a strip of dark cloth on his desk, the way a man lays down something he has finally decided he understands the weight of, and beside it, a newly printed archive tag, small and unassuming, that would from now on travel with the weapons record instead of the red-bordered classification that had started all of it. "The calibrator will read it correctly from now on," Vask said. "Verified self-defense. No further action. I confess I do not know what possessed the council to phrase it quite so dryly, given everything the phrase is quietly standing in for, but I suppose that is bureaucracy for you in any language on any world." He slid the rifle across the desk toward her. "It is yours again, Cadet Voss, unrestricted. I would understand if you never wanted to see the inside of an arms trials classroom again, after the week you've had." "I'll be there Thursday," Dara said, picking the rifle up, feeling the familiar worn weight of it settle back against her palm like something coming home. "It's still a class I need the credit for." Vask's long gray mouth did something that, on a human, would have been a smile. "Of course it is." Word of the tribunal's outcome had already outpaced the official record by the time Dara made it back to the human dormitory corridor, the way word always did on a station this size. And the reaction waiting for her there was not the uneasy silence of the classroom 5 days earlier, but something closer to a held breath finally let go. Sana met her at the door with an expression somewhere between relief and pure, undignified triumph, and behind her, crowded into the narrow corridor in a way that ceiling height clearly hadn't been designed for, stood most of the other 8 human cadets in the academy, several of whom Dara barely knew beyond a nod in the mess hall. "You closed an 81-year-old file and got the whole provisional review flipped from probation to early advancement in the same week," said a third-year cadet named Priya Anand, who Dara had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with in 18 months. "Some of us would like to buy you something resembling a drink, if the mess hall's synthesized approximation of one counts. It did apparently count, and the evening that followed was louder and looser than anything the restricted week had allowed. 9 humans crowded around 2 pushed-together tables built for larger bodies, trading stories that had nothing to do with archives or councils. Home, family, the particular strangeness of being the newest and smallest delegation in a compact built for giants. And Dara found herself, for the first time in 18 months, feeling less like a species under evaluation and more like exactly what she'd come here to be. A cadet, tired, among people who understood without being told what the week had cost her. The attention didn't end there, though, and the following 2 weeks brought a slower, stranger kind of pressure that Dara hadn't fully braced for. The tribunal record had gone out to every member world's oversight liaison as a matter of compact transparency policy, and with it had come a trickle of visitors to the academy that Corin dryly referred to once as the archive tourism problem. A delegation from a species called the Threna, themselves only 4 years into provisional status, and watching every precedent this compact set with obvious anxiety, requested a formal meeting with her, less to interrogate the classification and more, Dara realized within the first 10 minutes, to ask her, quietly, almost desperately, how a provisional species survived a review process this exposed without losing itself in the process. "You stay who you already were," Dara told them, across a low round table in a meeting room too bright and too cool for the conversation it was hosting. "That's the whole answer as far as I can tell. Everybody in that council chamber was trying to decide whether we were something to be afraid of. The only thing that ever actually worked was refusing to become that thing, even when it would have been easier." A second visit, less welcome, came from a media liaison representing 3 separate compact broadcast networks, requesting an exclusive interview about what one proposed segment title translated as, with excruciating literalness, "the girl the archive feared." Dara declined, politely, twice, and when the liaison pressed a 3rd time, sliding a compensation figure across the table that would have covered a full year of Sana's tuition twice over, she declined a 3rd time, just as politely, just as flatly. "You could tell your story on your own terms," the liaison said, clearly unused to the word no surviving 3 attempts. "Control the narrative before someone else does it for you." "My grandmother never told her story to anyone for 61 years, Dara said. "I don't think she was wrong to keep it quiet, even if it turned out the archive already had a copy she didn't know about. Some things don't need an audience to be true. I'd rather it stay that way." The liaison left disappointed, and Corin, who'd sat silently through the entire exchange at Dara's request, waited until the door closed before speaking. "You could have taken that," Corin said. "The compensation alone would have set you up considerably more comfortably than a cadet's stipend." "I know. Why didn't you?" Dara thought about it for a moment, turning the question over the way she'd learned to turn every question over that week, before answering honestly. "Because the whole reason any of this worked out was that I never tried to perform being brave for anyone watching. The second I start doing interviews about it, I start being aware of an audience, and I think that's exactly the version of this story that stops being true." She glanced at the rifle, propped now in the corner of her own dorm room rather than a confiscated evidence locker, its worn stock catching the dim gray dorm light. "My grandmother didn't do what she did for an audience either. She did it because a girl alone at night takes what she has. I'd like to keep that part of it intact, if it's all the same to everyone." Corin was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression Dara had come to recognize over the past 2 weeks as the instructor's particular version of approval, understated, unhurried, entirely without flourish. "Cadet Voss," Corin said finally, "I have taught arms trials for 11 years. I have seen perhaps 400 cadets pass through that classroom in that time, and I want you to understand that I do not say this lightly. You are the only one I can recall who improved my opinion of an entire species in the space of a single week without once trying to." She gathered her data slate, moving toward the door, and paused there with one long-jointed hand on the frame. "Thursday's class will resume standard curriculum. I expect you on time, weapon secured, same as everyone else. I would not want you thinking the last 2 weeks earned you any special treatment in my classroom." A pause, and something in her flat Ithran voice carried, just barely, the ghost of dry warmth. "Outside my classroom is, of course, an entirely different matter." She recorded the message home 2 nights later, sitting cross-legged on her bunk with the rifle across her knees, and the station's dimmed night cycle light doing its poor imitation of dusk. Because some things were easier to say to a small recording lens than they would have been face to face, even across the same kitchen table she'd grown up at. "Hey, Mom," she started, and then had to stop and start again, because the easy tone she'd meant to open with didn't survive contact with what she actually had to say. "So, I need to tell you something about Grandma Edda's rifle, and I need you to just let me get through it before you ask questions, because it's a long one." She told it plainly, the way she'd told the warden, the way her grandmother would have told it if she'd ever told it to anyone at all. The lights in the north pasture, the box that hummed, 3 shapes by moonlight and a 4th that got away clean, 61 years of a rifle kept oiled and loaded and never once explained. She told her mother about the calibrator, about the classroom laughter that had turned to silence in under 4 seconds, about a warden with no face who'd believed a ledger page from a farming journal over every modern sensor in the room. She told her about the Scarrow conquered, about 400 worlds harvested before anyone had fought back hard enough to matter, about a 16-year-old girl who'd put the first round through the humming box because she didn't like the sound of it and hadn't thought twice about the rest. "She never told anyone, Mom," Dara said, and her voice, steady through the whole rest of it, caught just slightly here. "Not you, not Grandpa, not the sheriff, nobody. She just kept the rifle ready for 61 years in case it ever happened again, and it never did, and she died never knowing that somewhere out there, an entire organization had written her name into a permanent record as the reason they stopped trying." She looked down at the rifle across her knees, ran a thumb along the worn edge of the stock the way she'd watched her grandmother do 1,000 times. "I used to think she was just careful. Overly careful, honestly. A woman who wouldn't let a rifle out of arm's reach even decades after the last thing worth shooting at had stopped bothering the henhouse. I think about that differently now. I think she wasn't being careful. I think she was keeping a promise to a 16-year-old girl on a ridge who decided that one night that nobody was ever going to get to treat her or anyone she loved like livestock again, and she just kept that promise quietly for the rest of her life and never once needed anyone to know she was keeping it." She let out a slow breath, the kind that had been building since the classroom 5 days ago. "I've got the rifle back. Council cleared everything. I'm okay, better than okay, honestly. I just needed you to hear all of it from me before some translated compact press release garbles half of it and you find out secondhand. I love you. I'll call properly this weekend." "Tell Grandma I said." She stopped, throat tight for just a moment, then finished it anyway. "Tell her I finally understand why she kept it loaded." She sent the recording, set the rifle back in its corner, and slept better that night than she had in 2 weeks. Thursday's arms trials class started the way every Thursday's class started. Instructor Corin at the front of the room. 12 weapons on the long steel table, diagnostic telemetry blinking from 11 of them, and nothing at all from the 12th, walnut-stocked, blued steel gone gray at the edges, resting dumb and unbothered in its place on the rack. This time, nobody laughed. "Cadet Voss," Corin said, running through roll with the same dry efficiency she always had. "Bring it up for classification, please." "Standard procedure. We run every weapon through the calibrator, same as always." Dara carried the rifle to the front of the room, set it in the cradle of soft blue light, and stepped back, And this time when the amber scanning light rose and the display began assembling its readout, 31 cadets from a dozen species watched in a silence that had nothing left of mockery in it at all, just quiet, focused attention. The particular respect a room gives something it has learned, the hard way, not to underestimate twice. The classification field bloomed onto the wall display, bordered now in a calm administrative blue rather than warning red. And inside it, in block compact script, sat a phrase that carried, for anyone who'd been on the station 3 weeks ago, considerably more weight than its dry bureaucratic wording let on. VERIFIED self-defense, no further action. Thank you, Cadet Voss, Corin said, and moved on to the next weapon on the table without further ceremony, because that, Dara had come to understand, was precisely the point. The classification had stopped being a spectacle and become, simply, a fact, filed and closed and no longer requiring anyone's fear to make sense of it. Asen Threll, 2 seats down, caught her eye as she returned to her place and gave her the smallest possible nod, the kind that had replaced, over the past 2 weeks, every trace of the bristling mockery he'd once worn as armor. Class ended without incident, the way most classes did, and Dara filed out with the rest of the room into a corridor that had gone back, mostly, to ordinary, cadets arguing about an upcoming navigation exam, someone complaining about mess hall rations, the low, ordinary hum of an institution that had briefly held its breath, and had now mostly let it go. It was 2 months later, in the same corridor, that Dara found herself walking beside Sana past a knot of new cadets clustered near the dormitory entrance, duffel bags at their feet, the particular wide-eyed exhaustion of people who had just made the long transit from Earth for the first time, 6 of them, the largest single human intake the Academy had ever received in one cycle, a direct result, Dean Vask had told her privately, of the Council's early advancement review clearing several procedural bottlenecks that had previously kept Earth's provisional cadet numbers artificially thin. One of them, a lanky boy who couldn't have been more than 17, was staring up at the 2 high ceilings with an expression Dara remembered wearing herself, 3 years and a lifetime ago, and when he caught sight of her passing, rifle slung, the same worn walnut stock, unmistakable now to anyone who'd followed even a fraction of the story that had rippled out through every provisional world's liaison network over the past 2 months. His eyes went wide in a different way entirely. "You're her," he said, "Cadet Voss, from the archive thing, the rifle." "I'm somebody who brought her grandmother's rifle to class and had a complicated week because of it," Dara said. "That's probably the more accurate version." "They told us about you before we even shipped out," the boy said, still staring, half at her, half at the rifle. "Some kind of orientation briefing. They said humans got early advancement because of what happened here, because of what you did." Dara considered that for a moment, the way she considered most things now, unhurried, turning it over before answering. "I didn't do anything, really. I brought a rifle to class because it was the only weapon I trusted, and then a lot of very patient, very thorough people spent 2 weeks proving something that was already true whether anybody found it or not. That's most of it, honestly." She shifted the rifle's sling on her shoulder, glancing at the boy's own gear, standard issue, new, still creased from packing. "What matters a lot more than any of that is what you do for the next 3 years. Nobody's going to remember the archive thing by the time you graduate. They're going to remember whether you showed up, kept your head down, and did the work without needing anyone to be impressed by it. That's the whole trick. It was never anything fancier than that." The boy nodded, uncertain, the way 17-year-olds nod at advice they haven't yet had the chance to test against anything real. And Sana, falling back into step beside Dara as they continued down the corridor, bumped her shoulder lightly against hers. "Look at you," Sana said. "Giving orientation speeches now." "I gave one speech to one nervous kid because he looked like he needed it." "Ma'am, and in 18 months, when there's 20 of us instead of 9, they're going to be telling that kid's version of the story to the new intake, and somewhere in it you're going to have become taller and probably fought off an entire extraction crew personally with your bare hands. Sana grinned sidelong. That's how these things go, Dara. You don't get a say in it anymore. Dara didn't answer that, not directly, but she thought, walking the rest of the corridor toward the human dormitory with the rifle's familiar weight against her shoulder, and the station's cold, recycled air moving steady around her, that her grandmother probably wouldn't have minded the story growing a little in the telling, so long as the true part of it, the part that mattered, the part about being still and accurate and not needing an audience to be either one, stayed exactly the way it had always been. Some things you kept honest, even while the rest of the world got busy making them into legend. That, more than anything else the past 2 months had taught her, felt like the last lesson worth learning from a woman who'd spent 61 years keeping a promise nobody but her had ever known she'd made. The joint field exercise came at the end of that same term, a capstone drill the Academy ran once a year across all combat track class standings, pairing cadets from different species into two-person teams and dropping them into a full-scale reconstruction of the same broken hill country biome the warden had once used to test her alone. This year, for the first time in the exercise's recorded history, the pairing algorithm run, allegedly, without any manual override, though Corin's dry non-answer when Dara asked about it suggested otherwise, put her with Asen Threll. I requested it, Asen admitted, on the walk to the staging annex when she finally pressed him on it. Formally, through proper channels 3 weeks ago. I told the coordinating instructor I wanted to understand how you actually think under pressure, not just how you fight when someone else starts it. He said that was, in his exact words, an unusually mature reason for a request he normally has to deny for being a grudge match in disguise. A faint clicking of mandibles, close enough to a laugh that Dara had learned to recognize it as one. I did point out that I had already lost the grudge match version, quite thoroughly, and had no further interest in repeating it. The drill's brief was straightforward, and its execution anything but. Retrieve a simulated data cache from the ridge's far marker, evade a rotating set of tracked hazard drones calibrated to hunt by movement and heat signature, and do it as a team, which meant every decision either of them made now had to account for a partner whose instincts, whose reach, whose entire threat model ran on different biology than her own. It took her less than an hour to understand something about Asen that 3 years of classroom proximity hadn't taught her, that underneath the warrior cast bluster, he thought carefully, quickly, and well, once he trusted the person beside him enough to stop performing confidence and start actually using his head. He read terrain the way she read weather, instinctively, and where her strength lay in patience and economy of motion. His lay in raw, sudden reach that could close a gap or clear an obstacle in half the time it would have taken her alone. There, he said low, at the 2nd hour mark, nodding toward a drone patrol pattern cutting across their intended route at a rock choke point neither of them could avoid without losing an hour on the detour. It cycles a blind window every 40 seconds. I can see it in the wing movement. Nobody built this thing expecting Keith Ronnie eyes to track that fast. Then we use your eyes and my hands, Dara said, already working the problem the way her grandmother had taught her to work every problem that had no clean textbook answer. Break it down. Use what you have. Don't wait for the ideal solution to show up on its own. You call the window. I go through low and disable the tracking relay on the way past. You follow once it's dark, and we're both clear before the next cycle even starts. It worked exactly as planned, which surprised neither of them nearly as much as how naturally the plan had come together. No negotiation, no ego, no wasted breath convincing the other that their read of the situation was correct. They crossed the marker beacon with time to spare, the second fastest completion in the exercise's recorded history, beaten only by a pair of senior-year specialists who'd run the drill 11 times before and knew the terrain by heart. Not bad, Asen said, breathing hard, dropping onto a flat rock near the marker to catch his breath while Dara logged their completion time on the field terminal. For a team that has apparently never once trained together before today. We trained together on the mat, Dara said, just from opposite sides of the same lesson. He considered that, mandibles still, and nodded slowly, the particular stillness of a mind turning something over and finding it held up under the weight. My father is a company commander back home, he said, after a moment, in a tone that had none of his usual bravado in it at all. Old-line Keith Ronnie, the kind who still believes strength wins every argument eventually, given enough time. I used to believe that without questioning it, because questioning it never occurred to me as something a person did. He looked out at the false ridge line, the projected sun sliding toward a projected evening. I am going to write to him about this drill. I do not know yet how to explain what it felt like, working with someone whose whole approach to a problem was so completely unlike mine, and somehow made both of our approaches better instead of getting in each other's way. I suspect he will not entirely understand it. I intend to try anyway. That's usually how it starts, Dara said. Somebody tries to explain something to somebody who doesn't quite get it yet. You don't win the argument in one letter. You just keep being the version of yourself that makes the argument true, and eventually it stops being an argument at all. She sat down on the rock beside him, the two of them watching the false light fade toward the exercise's automated end of cycle, and found, sitting there, that she didn't much mind the quiet. My grandmother never explained anything to anybody either. She just kept being exactly who she was for 61 years, and let the explaining take care of itself eventually. Took 81 years in her case. I'm hoping yours takes less. Asen huffed something that might have been a laugh, mandibles clicking once, easy now in a way they'd never been in that first week. I would settle for considerably less than 81 years, yes. 6 weeks after the tribunal, Liaison Meskin requested one final meeting, and this one, unlike the others, wasn't held in a chamber built for cross-examination. It was a small conference room off the administrative wing, warm light instead of cold, and Meskin herself looked less like a committee member cataloging a variable and more like a woman who had spent 6 weeks working very hard and hadn't fully caught up on sleep because of it. The Scarrow Concord was dissolved a century and a half ago, Meskin said, without preamble, sliding a data slate across the table toward Dara. Formally, on paper. What the archive investigation into your world's file uncovered, however, is that dissolution and disappearance are not the same thing. Farron's deep search didn't stop at Earth's case. Once the search parameters were validated against a confirmed alpha-tier reclassification, the archive's pattern-matching systems flagged 11 other worlds carrying the same tier of unexamined, context-stripped classification. Flags that had sat quiet in that archive for anywhere from 40 to 200 years. Never reopened, never questioned. Exactly the way yours sat quiet until a calibrator scan forced the question. Dara looked at the slate, at a list of 11 world designations she didn't recognize, most marked only by coordinate strings rather than names, the way Earth itself had once been marked before anyone bothered to ask what those coordinates actually meant to the people living on them. You're telling me there are 11 more of us, Dara said slowly. 11 more worlds the Conquered tried this on. I am telling you there are at least 11 more files, Meskin said. Whether there are 11 more worlds like yours, worlds that fought back, ended the operation, and simply never knew what they'd stopped, or worlds where the operation succeeded, and no one is left to ask the question at all, is exactly what the follow-up investigation exists to determine. The Council authorized it 3 days ago unanimously, which I am told is the fastest unanimous vote that Chamber has produced in longer than I've served on it. They are calling it, formally, the Conquered Reclamation Review. Less formally, among the staff running it, they are calling it the Voss Precedent. A faint, tired, almost smile. You did not ask for a legal legacy, Cadet Voss. I am afraid you have one regardless. What do you need from me? Less than you might expect, Meskin said. "A statement on record describing how your case unfolded, not as testimony this time, simply as a template other investigators can use to know what they're looking for. Some worlds on that list may still have living witnesses, the way you had your grandmother's ledger. Others may not, and for those, the only justice available now is having the file finally read honestly instead of left to gather dust as an unexplained fear. I would like your permission to use your case as the model for how that reading gets done. You are, whether you asked for it or not, the reason any of those 11 files are being reopened at all." Dara thought about her grandmother's cramped handwriting, about 61 years of a rifle kept oiled and ready and never once explained to anyone, about a fourth shape that had gotten away clean into the dark and apparently gone on to try the same operation on other worlds that had never gotten the chance to write their own version of that ledger page. "You have my permission," she said, "but I want one more thing added to the record if the council will allow it." "Which is?" "Say it plainly, the way the warden did for me. Don't let the next 11 cases get buried in the same dry administrative language that almost let mine get lost for 81 years. Whoever reads those files next should understand exactly what they're looking at the first time, not the fifth." Dara pushed the slate back across the table. "My grandmother didn't get an apology. I understand why. She was gone before anyone even knew there was anything to apologize for. But if there are people alive on any of those 11 worlds who spent decades wondering why an old fear never fully made sense, I'd like them to get the plain version, the first time somebody finally tells them. They've waited long enough." Meskin studied her for a long moment, and then nodded, once, formal and final, the closest thing to a promise a council liaison was permitted to give on record. "I'll see that they do," she said. A message reached her, 3 months after that, from one of the 11 worlds on Meskin's list, rooted through so many layers of compact translation protocol that the greeting alone took up half the page. But the substance of it, once Dara worked through the formal phrasing, was simple enough to knock the breath out of her all the same. A small delegation from a world called, in translation, the Long Marsh Territories had found, in records their own elders had kept as private oral history rather than written fact, an account of a hunting party that vanished into a coastal fog 2 centuries ago and never returned, and a strange dark shape that had been seen leaving the marsh at speed shortly after, never explained, never repeated. Nobody on that world had ever known why the fog hunters stopped coming. They had simply, eventually, stopped waiting for an explanation and folded the story into legend instead, the way frightened people do with anything that refuses to make sense. The message thanked her, formally, stiffly, in language clearly not built for this kind of gratitude, for making it possible for their own investigators to finally ask the right question of their own archive file, and included, at the very end, a short line that had nothing formal about it at all, added, Dara suspected, by whoever on that delegation had actually written the message rather than approved its translation. "We did not know we had one until you proved someone else already had. Our elders will finally get to tell that story as truth instead of myth. Thank you for making that possible, though you have never met us and likely never will." Dara read it twice, sitting alone in her dorm room with the station's gray dusk light coming in low through the round viewport, and thought about a marsh 2 centuries and half a galaxy away from a Montana ridge line, about frightened people on 2 worlds who had never met, never would, and had each, in their own way, simply done what needed doing, and let the explaining wait for someone patient enough to finally come looking for it. She didn't write back anything clever. She wasn't sure there was anything clever to say to a message like that. She wrote back 3 lines, plain and true, the only kind of answer that had ever actually worked for her this whole strange season, that she was glad the file had finally been read right, that she hoped their elders got to tell it exactly the way it had actually happened, and that some promises, it turned out, were worth keeping quietly for a very long time, because you never knew in advance who else might need them kept. The last scene that stayed with her, months after the term ended, was a small one, private, the kind that never made it into any council record or academy report, and never would. A Thursday evening late, the dorm quiet, Sana already asleep across the room, Dara sitting on the edge of her bunk with the rifle broken down across a cleaning cloth spread over her knees, running an oiled patch down the barrel the exact way her grandmother had taught her on a porch 100 light years and a lifetime away. She didn't need to clean it. The armory here handled maintenance on Academy-registered weapons as a matter of course, and the rifle, by any practical measure, was in better condition now than it had been in decades. She did it anyway, the same slow, unhurried motion every few weeks, not because the rifle needed it, but because some rituals were never really about the object in your hands. They were about the person who taught you to hold it, and the promise, unspoken and never fully explained, that you'd keep doing it the way they'd shown you, for exactly as long as it took. Outside her small round viewport, the calyx anchor turned slow beneath a wash of unfamiliar stars, and somewhere far beyond even those, a quiet farmhouse sat dark under an earth sky her grandmother had once stood beneath at 16 years old, rifle in hand, deciding, without ceremony, without an audience, without ever once raising her voice about it, that nobody was going to take what wasn't theirs to take. Dara ran the last patch through the barrel, checked the action one final time by feel alone, eyes closed, the way she'd been taught, and set the rifle back together with hands that didn't need to think about the motion anymore. It had never been a joke. It had never been a threat either, not really, not in the way the word usually meant. It was just a promise, kept quiet and kept ready, passed down the only way promises like that ever really get passed down, not explained, not performed, just carried steadily by someone willing to be still and accurate at the same time, for as long as it took. She set it in its place by the door, safe, secured, ready, and turned out the light.